Okay, so we're talking about the conversation I had with Bill Craig the other day, Cameron's Capturing Christianity channel, which I guess was an interesting exchange. Felt like it took about 2 seconds to run through. From my point of view, it all disappeared very quickly, and it was weird that we started talking and then Cameron was like, "Oh, we're going to move on to the next topic in a minute," and I was thinking, "Hold on, we haven't even started talking about the actual topic yet. We've just sort of gone skirmished on the outside of the issue. I haven't actually said the thing yet that I wanted to say about this." So that was, yeah, I think it's always like that, having a live conversation in those sorts of contexts. But yeah, do either of you want to have anything you wanted to say to kick us off?
A couple of things struck me. One was Craig's attempt to stick you with a fairly heavy burden of proof. He wanted you to be arguing that it's absolutely impossible for it to be the case that the past has a beginning. And I do not understand you to be arguing that at all.
Yeah.
So maybe you could say something about that.
Yeah, right. Okay, so I definitely didn't come in there with an argument that the past didn't have a beginning. I'm not of the view that the past didn't have a beginning. I think I tried to say this at some point in the debate, but I'm of the view that I don't know if it's easy. I don't know if it's possible to really say things conclusively about that type of grand metaphysical principle or whatever. Like, I just don't know if I could. I think it's just always going to be beyond my ken to know whether the universe had a beginning or it will have an end or those types of, if space has an extent or something. Like, it might be knowable, but I don't think I could know it. And I don't have an argument where I claim to be able to prove it to other people. No, my position was more that I don't buy Craig's attempt that he can show that it does have a beginning. So it's just a destructive kind of, I don't think his argument works, rather than I have an argument that points in exactly the opposite direction and I can prove that that's true as well.
He then tried to work you into the position of having to support the view that the past has a beginning if and only if the future has an end. And I don't think that's what you're arguing either.
Yeah, right. That's helpful as well, because I think that I responded in the wrong way. But I kind of responded in the wrong way about that, because I sort of accepted a premise there that I shouldn't have done. The way this works is, if you think that what he says about the actual infinite is good, and that you know, his Hilbert's Hotel ideas and the infinite library and stuff, if you bought all of that, then you couldn't have an asymmetric view about time. That's what I was trying to say. I'm not saying I actually do buy that stuff at the beginning. It's just like, well, if you've bought that stuff about Hilbert's Hotel being absurd, therefore the past couldn't have a beginning, then you can't have an asymmetric view. And that's just to anyone who is motivated by Craig's Hilbert's Hotel argument. So it's not that I actually do think that, because I'm not particularly motivated by those Hilbert's Hotel examples. So yeah, you're right. I felt like, on reflection, I took a burden of proof there. I ended up sort of nodding along and going, yes, I agree with you. And what I meant, I think what I should have said was more clearly, that burden of proof is there for anyone who's accepted your arguments about Hilbert's Hotel. And, you know, for the sake of the argument, I'll go along with it just to show where the consequences are. And the consequences are
right. So the point is that if his argument were any good, it would show not only that the past has a beginning, but that the future must have an end.
Right, exactly, yes.
And now the other thing related to this is his claim that this is an ad hominem argument. And I was surprised that you seem to be going along with that. It doesn't seem to me to be an ad hominem argument. I mean, in the sense that that it's an argument that's only addressed to the internal consistency of some position that says both that Craig's argument is correct, and that the future and that the future has no end. I mean, it seems very plausible to me, at least, to say that the future could be endless. Whether it is endless is another question. But whether it could be endless, whether it could now be the case that for each moment of time there will be a later moment of time, whether it could now be the case that for each event there will be a later event, in which case the future would be endless, that just seems obviously possible to me. So, you know, I think the burden would be on whoever says, well, the future has to come to an end, but not at any particular time, or not at any particular range of times in the future. The burden would be on them to explain their position.
Yeah, can I add on to that? I actually look at this as not ad hominem. It's more of a reductio on the argument. So, you know, we look at Craig's argument allegedly showing that the past has to have a beginning, and that same reasoning shows that the future must have an end. But it seems to me the right thing to say there is, well, obviously there's something wrong with the reasoning, because surely this philosophical argument that we're considering doesn't really prove that it's impossible for time to be endless. So it seems like it's just, you should take it to be a reductio. I think that's the way I put it in my my first paper, as more of a reductio. I feel like in your recent paper that the two of you guys wrote, I feel like you even say in there, we think it's plausible that it's possible for the future to be infinite. And so it seems like you're setting it up in that paper, at least, as also as a reductio. And I think that that's just the right way to do it. And then Craig's response to that is to say, well, then you're just begging the question. Now, at that point, because now we have an apparently sound argument that leads to the conclusion that time must have an end. And he's thinking the rational thing in that situation is to accept that conclusion. But that's just wrong, because the rejection of the conclusion is more likely than any of the premises in his argument.
Yeah, right. So it's just that the possibility that the future doesn't come to an end is intuitively plausible, more so than the idea that the weirdness of Hilbert's Hotel means that it's impossible. It's like, you know, if you have to choose between buying one of those two propositions and you can't buy both, which is what the argument seems to show, then the thought would be, well, I'm going to keep the possibility that the future is endless. And that shows me that something in Craig's original argument is wrong. And I guess I do think that's a reasonable way to look at it. And then I'm inclined to say that the Hilbert's Hotel idea just shows that it's weird, but doesn't show that it's impossible. And that just seems like a way of reconciling it. Just like it doesn't motivate that the past would have a beginning. It just shows that if the past didn't have a beginning, weird stuff would happen, or weird stuff would be possible. And it's the same, you know, it's the same weird stuff that would be possible if the future had no end as well, of course, because, you know, everything that you say about Hilbert's Hotel in the past, you can say about it in the future too. Like, how many moments will there be? An infinite number, then a couple of moments pass by, and you think, well, there must be fewer numbers to come. No, there's just the same amount of numbers, and that's just the Hilbert's Hotel paradox about, like, a couple of guests leave the hotel and there's the same number of guests in the hotel. So whatever's paradoxical about Hilbert's Hotel, you just kind of learn to go, well, that's what it's like, you know, and then that feels like the right way to go there. I suppose maybe I talked myself into thinking that there is something about the combination of beliefs that are held by certain types of theists. And to my mind, Craig's has never said, oh, but I just am not one of those theists. Like, I don't know what his theology
is one of
about
those
this.
theists.
Yeah, right. Okay.
That's just it.
So that's the temptation, is that like it is his combination of views that it's being challenged directly, and like as an ad hominem, it's quite an effective one, I guess. There's you don't have to read it as an ad hominem, but like it is, he could back out of the argument, but only by denying something that he actually does believe, and he'd have to change his beliefs there. It seems to me on some level something has to go. So I guess I was trying to push it because I know that it applies to his set of beliefs. But you're right to push me back on that. It doesn't have to be portrayed as an ad hominem, because the idea, the possibility that the future has no end is intrinsically plausible as a metaphysical principle on its own. So you don't have to just pick someone who holds that belief. You can motivate that as plausible as any other kind of candidate metaphysical principle, I guess. So yeah, no, I think I didn't play that bit of the debate very well. Yeah.
Another point at which that really got my attention was when the moderator Cameron raised the following objection to Craig. He said, "Well, how can it be that the past is actually infinite if, according to as you hold, past events do not exist?"
Mm-hmm.
And Craig's answer began with saying that you can count them because you can count them.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And then by way of explaining why you can count them, past events that is, he said that they have been instantiated in reality or something like that. And I thought, well, okay, future events will be instantiated in reality. We can count them too, can't we?
Mm-hmm.
And so I would have liked to ask Craig, do you suppose that that Landon is going to say the number 1 tomorrow, and the day after that he's going to say the number 2, and the day after that he's going to say the number 3, and after that Landon will never ever say another number? Now, how many numbers is Landon going to say? It's unbelievable to me that Craig would say 0,
Mm-hmm.
but that is the answer that he gave in the debate when it comes to an endless future. He said that the answer is 0. 0 events will occur because those events don't exist. But of course, he doesn't think past events exist either. So when asked how it is that he can say that a beginningless series of past events would be an actual infinite, his reply is, well, because we can count them.
Mm.
But that doesn't establish any asymmetry between past and future. We can count future events as well. And in his recent book, God Over All, Craig takes the view that the problem of referring to past events is a non-problem. Why? Because singular terms and first-order quantifiers are not ontologically committing. So the view is that we can refer to past events and we can count them even though they don't exist. Well, then how is it that he says we can't simply count future events in the same way and come up with similar conclusions? Why can't we refer to future events? They have not yet been instantiated in reality, but they will be instantiated in reality. So what's the problem? I thought that was a point at which his response was just utterly unsatisfactory.
Well, I did try and come back and say something like that, saying, well, he says, they have been, and that's the difference between them and the future ones. But of course, the future ones will be, and why is it that pointing to the past tense and saying, well, they're in the past tense, and that's the difference? I mean, you may as well just say, well, because they're past and the other ones are future. The point is, why is that? What's relevantly different about that? I mean, because on its face, everything you can say about in the past tense about those past times, you can say the same thing about the future. So because you can say, well, how many events will have, or how many events have been if the past is infinite, an infinite amount. How many events will be, the future is infinite, an infinite amount. So it and just changing tense doesn't seem like it changes anything relevant about the situation. I mean, it does. What it doesn't do is escape. If there's something problematic about a collection having Cantor's property, right, being able to line up proper parts with the whole and show that they're equivalent, if that's bad, what you need to do is not just show that one set of claims is in the past tense and the other one's in the future tense. What you have to do is show that by changing tense, you've escaped that property if you're trying to show a relevant symmetry breaker. So just pointing to the fact that it's in a different tense, that is a difference, but it's an irrelevant difference because it doesn't solve whatever problem that you found that came from Cantor's property. And that's the game here, that when we're saying, where's your symmetry breaker? What we're asking for is, tell me something about the past that's different from the future, such that the problematic consequences of Cantor's property holding of the past doesn't apply to the future. Like, that's the question. So just saying, well, because we have counted them and we were, that's not relevant. It doesn't make any difference to the outcome, which is when you enumerate them, you find you've got an actually infinite number of them. So yeah, it's crazy, really. It's sort of maddening somehow to run around in this little circle of it's sort of unbelievable that someone can think that that's an escape route here, and yet from his point of view, it seems like what I'm saying is maddening and unbelievable, and he doesn't understand how I don't get it, right? So there's I tried to say at some point, it feels like we're just talking past each other, some like communication issue or something, because it can't be that you don't get it. Like, it's black and white, right? Like, I mean, so yeah.
The thing is that we understand him, but he doesn't understand us.
But he thinks it's the other way around.
He thinks it's the other way around, but he's mistaken.
Yeah. I'll say every time I think about this, I just think it's close to self-evident that your answer is correct here, and that Craig is just counting when he says it's a potential infinite in the future. I just feel like it seems obvious that he's counting what you were calling the future perfect tense. So, I mean, if we can go back to that marble analogy you gave in the debate, you said, suppose, what is it, every minute I drop a marble into a jar, and suppose I'm going to continue doing that forever. How many marbles will I drop into the jar? And you're giving an answer to that, an actually infinite number. And Craig is saying, no, it's a potentially infinite. And the interesting thing was when he came back and responded to you, he just said something along the lines of, your own illustration shows there will never be an infinite number of marbles that you drop into the jar. In other words, there will never be an infinite number of marbles in the jar. That's my interpretation of what he's saying. But that's exactly what you were agreeing with. Yeah, what's in the jar is a potential infinite. That's the collection that's growing. Mm-hmm. And it seems like that's all he had to say in response was, it will never be an actual infinite in the jar. But that's precisely the point. That's not the collection that you're talking about at all.
The marbles in the jar represent the past events, mm-hmm. the series of past events. And that series, assuming that there was a first marble dropped in the jar, that series will always be finite and will be continually growing forever. And that's the series that, in Craig's sense of that expression, is a potential infinite.
Yeah.
Because it's always finite, but it continually grows toward infinity as a limit. But that isn't what we were talking about. What we were talking about is the marbles that have not yet been put in the jar. Mm-hmm. And it's very strange when Craig does address that question, all he says is that they don't exist.
Yeah.
But then again, you could also just change the thought experiment. Imagine that when I guess the way you had to change it was a new marble pops into existence and then I drop it into the jar. But now put a presentist reading on that. When it hits the bottom of the jar, it disappears out of existence, right? And then you could say, in an eternal past, how many marbles have I dropped into the jar? An actual infinite number. But then you could imagine somebody coming along and saying, wait a second, your own illustration shows there has never been an infinite number of marbles in the jar. Yeah, of course. There's no time at which there's an infinite number of marbles in the jar.
There's never more than one marble in the jar.
Yeah.
Right.
If that, I mean, the vanishing present. I mean,
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, exactly. So it was really, and I was trying to say, look, imagine if because this feels to me like the salient point, right? If I can put marbles in the jar, and you want to say, for it to be a potentially infinite number of marbles in the jar, in Craig's sense, I have to start with none and put the first one in, keep adding. And then the idea would be, I never finish putting marbles into the jar. And the number of marbles is increasing towards infinity as a limit without ever getting there, whatever. And I was trying to say, look, I have to have, if the pile of marbles that's outside the jar, like in front of me, if that was a finite pile of marbles, then the number of marbles in the jar wouldn't be potentially infinite. It would just be a series that stops at some point when I run out of new marbles to put into it, right? So for there to be, so if I've got 10 marbles in front of me, I'm only going to at most put 10 marbles in the jar, and then I don't have any more. So that's like saying if the future only has 10 minutes left to run, then there's only, the number of moments that's going to be passed will be at most 10 when we run out of time. Like if time starts now and there's 10 moments left before it finishes, that the most passed there'll be is 10 moments. But for that to be increasing limitlessly, then there must be not some finite pile of marbles there that I will eventually run out of. There has to be an infinite pile of marbles there, such that no matter how many I've taken out, there's still more left, right? And so it has to have that property of Hilbert's Hotel. Like no matter how many guests leave one after another, there always is more guests left to fill up the hotel. So I was to me, it seems like a really straightforward analogy, right? That the number of marbles over here, not yet in the jar, is the future, and that has to be infinite. Otherwise, I'll run out of them at some point. And the potential infinite is like eating them. And for it to be able to constantly eat these things in the future, there has to be a limitless source that's constantly there, that never runs out. And it just seems to me that that's the way that the potential infinite sort of implies the actual infinite, right? You can't really have a potential infinite if there's only a finite source of food for it to eat, right? For a potential infinite to be able to grow forever, it has to have a limitless supply, an actual infinite that feeds it. So in my head, I mean, Graham Priest calls it the domain principle, and I think Cantor liked this principle at one point, and it just seems right to me. A lot of people don't think that, but I mean, it just seems right. The domain has to be actually infinite if the variable can increase potentially infinitely. Right? It just seems like a straightforward truism in my head. I fail to see what's wrong with that. But anyway, yeah. So and then he just said, well, there is no pile of marbles.
but we have to allow the domain then to include non-existent future events that
so.
do not exist but will exist. And so the pile of marbles, I mean, since we're not at this point challenging Craig's presentism, and we're not switching over to some sort of spotlight theory of time, moving spotlight theory of time, where the pile of marbles is really there and the spotlight, successively picks out different ones of them. We're allowing that the pile of marbles doesn't exist, right? But what they represent is the infinite series of marbles, each of which will exist.
Yeah.
Each of which will exist and will be dropped into the jar. And those are countable. And the domain principle that you just referenced seems exactly correct if we allow non-existent future events into our domain.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it just seems perfectly obvious. So if you go back to the example where the marble pops into existence and then drop it into the jar and then it ceases to exist, and suppose that that's been going on forever into the past and it will continue forever into the future, I could ask the question, how many marbles have popped into existence? And that has got to be the same answer. You have to give the same answer to that as you give to the question, how many have you dropped into the jar? Right? Each one that popped into existence was dropped into the jar. But by the same token, how many will pop into existence? The same number as the number that will be dropped into the jar. But by the same token, it seems you could just take the one from a minute ago that popped into existence and you dropped into the jar, and the one from a minute from now that will pop into existence and be dropped into a jar, and those two correspond, and then you take the one from 2 minutes ago and 2 minutes into the future, and those two correspond, and so you have a perfect correspondence. So your answer to each collection has to have the same size because there's a one-to-one correspondence. But when I brought that point up in my paper, when Craig replied to that, he just fell back onto the idea that there are no future events, but the number of, so the number is 0, but the number of past events is actually infinite in the thought experiment. So he wants to hold on to the idea that the number of past events in that scenario is actually infinite and the number of future events is 0. And it sounds to me like he's just trying to smuggle in something like the growing block theory or something like that to get that conclusion, because that you can't get that conclusion with presentism.
What he has is something very like the growing block theory going, except that on the growing block theory, the past events are real. He says they're not. But somehow, the sum total of events that have happened, right, will be actually infinite if there's no first event. So if there's no first event, the events that have happened can be put in one-to-one correspondence with the natural numbers, and so they are an actual infinite. And it's a continually growing block, as it were, of events that have happened. That surely is the way he's thinking about it, and it's in that sense that he has a potential infinite. It's the past that's potentially infinite. Even if it has a beginning, it's potentially infinite because it can continually be added to.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, he thinks that so right at the beginning of the debate, I, for some reason, brought up. I mean, it was hard because he said, I couldn't help but try and problematize the notion of the potential infinite, because it's a term that Craig uses in an idiomatic sense, and it's misleading, I think, to some people who might be listening who haven't read other philosophers talking about that similar topic, or just read the philosophy of literature area of that, and think that that's just the only way anyone's ever thought about that term. And actually, it's very problematic. It's more problematic actually in terms of like what it means than the actual infinite, which ever since Cantor, even though there's some controversy even on what it means, is much less controversial now. It's more or less the community sort of settled on roughly what that concept means. But the notion of the potential infinite now is like there's hardly any agreement about that. You find people who say that there's no coherent notion of the potential infinite. Well, at least the only ones that anyone could put forward collapse into the actual infinite when you think about it. And I tried to point out that, look, from Aristotle's point of view, Aristotle thinks the past and the future both have are both infinite, and neither has a beginning or an end. But he doesn't think that makes them actually infinite. But it's not because he has Craig's definition of the potential infinite at hand. He doesn't have that. He's just got a different definition. As I tried to explain, his definition is something like potential infinite has its infinite extent smoothed out over the extent of time. So you can constantly divide a line over and over and over again, and it's potentially infinitely divisible because the divisibility of it just, the infinite extent of its divisibility is never all present at one point, right? But he thinks, you couldn't have an infinitely big object because its infinite extent would be present all at once, right? So you can spread things out. Like you could have an object that grows forever and gets bigger and bigger and bigger. So that's what he means. That's the whole point of the original Aristotelian idea, was you say, well, we can have infinity in that sense and rule out actual infinity in the sense of it being present together, all of the infinite extent of it being present together at the same time. So it's all about time. I mean, for Aristotle, modality is basically reduces down to temporal notions too. So it's not like that surprising that his idea of the infinite basically reduces down to a really key idea about how time works as well. But anyway, the idea for him was the past can be potentially infinite just because it's infinite, but its infinite extent is spread out over time, obviously. But then Craig came back with, but that's obviously wrong because it would mean that the past would have to be extending backwards in the past direction. But it's like only if he had your definition of the potential infinite, which means like growing forever without getting to infinity. But he doesn't have that. He just means is infinite, but it's spread out over time. There's no idea of growing. It doesn't actually have to be part of it, right? It's just like your idiomatic definition, and you're pasting it onto Aristotle and then saying that he's wrong because the consequence he drew wasn't the one that we would draw if he used your definition. And that seemed like, I don't know, it just seemed like he didn't understand what I was saying. And I'm not, it's not like I'm an Aristotle scholar. I'm just reading Aristotle scholars, right? Like more. And so I don't know, that part of it just seemed to me like, I don't know, his use of the potential infinitely more idiomatic than I think many people in his audience would realize.
There's another troubling aspect of the phrase potential infinite and the way it's likely to be heard. Does it mean, let's go with roughly Craig's idea, that it's a growing, the idea is that we have a collection that's growing toward infinity as a limit. Is the thought that for each number of elements that could have been added to the collection, another could be added? Or is the idea that another element will be added to the collection? Now, this is important because what you and I were talking about in our paper, Alex, was the thought that it could be the case that an additional element will be added continually forever. That's what's possible. It's possible that one will be added, then a second will be added, then a third. Now, is that a potential infinite? I think Craig wants to say so. I think Craig wants to say that that what's potentially infinite, that would be a potentially infinite collection. But here's where your point about the future versus the future perfect comes in. It seems to me that what's potentially infinite in Craig's own idiosyncratic sense is between the beginning, the time between the beginning of the addings in, and wherever the now will have gotten to at some future time. Now that is the collection that is always finite, that is growing, and grows toward infinity as a limit. But that, of course, is not what we were calling actual infinite. What we were talking about was that pile of marbles that has yet to be added in, but will be. And that's where the actual infinite is. I found myself repeatedly wanting to ask Craig, look, do you or do you not agree that it is now possible that for each natural number, Cameron will say that number?
He agrees with that.
Well, he said when he actually, I looked carefully, and what he actually said was Cameron can add one.
Oh, yeah. He actually, so when you get to that allegation that you were making a modal scope error, actually, the way Craig phrased your reasoning was just wrong. And so I do want to circle back around to that, but I just want to flag something related to this actual and potential thing before we do the counting argument, which is I worry that, Craig has this ontology where the past is actual, it's been actualized, so it's part of the actual world, whereas the future is merely potential, because it's just full of potentialities that have not exited from their causes or something like that. And I feel like when he uses actual and potential in that context, it's easy to equivocate and then say, well, then the past is actually infinite and the future is potentially infinite. But I'm not sure that actual and potential mean the same thing in those two different contexts. I feel like there's a little sleight of hand there.
That's right. That's definitely right. And I think, again, this is I feel like every time I talk about this with someone, I go, yeah, there's a bit of our paper where we say, because there's a bit of our paper where we say exactly that thing, right? You shouldn't confuse, the actual infinite is a question of cardinality, right? Like, does it have a cardinality such that you can show that proper parts of it equivalent to the whole? And if the objects that you're talking about are potentialities, things that haven't yet become actualized or something, like it's a potential for me to learn Spanish or something. I haven't done that yet, but I could do. That might be something I do tomorrow, whatever. And you could count the number of potentialities. So you can have an actually infinite collection of things which are, ontologically speaking, potentialities. It doesn't stop the cardinality of that set being actually infinite. So they are two logically independent terms. They have the same, it's the same terminology, annoyingly, actual and potential, but they are logically independent. And in fact, even in, I think, the physics, Aristotle makes a similar point where he says something like, so are you saying, he imagines some like critic saying to him, well, is a potential infinite something that could become actually infinite? And he says, no, potential infinite can't become actually infinite, right? So that shows you that the term potential infinite doesn't mean potential in the sense of could be, right? It's, potential infinite couldn't be infinite. It has to be finite. Right? Potential infinite just is a new term, and he's reusing an old word for a completely different concept. So we should just call it something like an uncompletable infinity or something, as opposed to a completed infinity. And then we would just wash away all this confusion about actual and potential infinites, because it just has no relation to that Aristotelian idea of actualization and potentialities and stuff. Those are just, and much confusion has been sown with the overlap of those words, even though Aristotle tried to tell us 2,500 years ago, whatever, not to get confused by that. We're still getting confused by that today. It's annoying. But yeah, no, it's also a good point. Should we move on to the scope distinction thing?
Well, I was wondering, maybe before we do that, it might be worthwhile. I don't know if you want to come back around to it, but so I think, to diagnose what's going on here in the in the debate, it seems like Craig is still trying to resist the idea that the answer to your question is actually infinite, which I think it clearly is. I think you can demonstrate it conclusively, and I think you did in your paper, but I think you can, as long as you can get people to admit that in the scenario Wes mentioned a little while ago, I will count 3 numbers in the next 3 days. As long as you admit that, then you can't say that the answer to your question is a potential infinite. And the reason for that is just by Craig's definition of a potential infinite, it's a collection that is finite but always growing. And you can just show that the answer to the question, how many numbers will I count if I count forever, that the answer can't be finite at any point and then growing. So I think that there's a clear argument there. But I guess what I want to point out is, I think that what Craig wants to say is something like an actually infinite number of things cannot be instantiated in reality in some fashion. So, I mean, his statement of the premise is an actual infinite cannot exist, which is vague. So I take it to mean an actually infinite number of things cannot exist, but he wants it to mean something like there's no possible world in which an actually infinite number of things is actualized. And so what he's going to do at this point is reformulate the argument or borrow a different formulation of the argument where the past does give rise to the problematic thing that he's pointing to, where there is an actualized actual infinite, but whereas the future never does give rise to it. Even if he says, he's got to say, even though he doesn't want to, he's got to say that the future is actually infinite, or in the sense that you mean it, but that doesn't commit him to saying that, for example, at any time in the future, or at any particular time in the future, an actual infinite will be instantiated. Does that make sense? So I think he has a move here to make, which is to focus on formulations of the argument where it doesn't even give rise to your past future symmetry objection. And right. So that's what he actually does. That's what he appealed to, at least in his most recent publication. And he mentioned it like in Q&A during your conversation. He can just use different formulations, like the one that I offered at the very end of my first paper.
But then isn't the formulation then like Locke's argument, right? Isn't the idea that if the past was infinite, then you could have accumulated one by one an infinite number of, say, hotel rooms, but there's no asymmetry in that sense in the future, because if I start accumulating hotel rooms now, there'll never exist an infinite number of hotel rooms, all together at the same time, and it looks like it's an asymmetry. And what I found, I don't know about you, Wes, but I've been thinking more about that objection that the reviewer suggested, if you remember. So the idea was if the past is actually infinite, and you've been creating hotel rooms ex nihilo and not destroying any, finite number of hotel rooms and not destroying any on each past day, then what you'd have now would be an infinite hotel. And the idea is supposed to be, well, God has the possibility, right, within his omnipotence on each given day to create a finite number of hotel rooms ex nihilo and not destroy any. So that means that you've got a series of premises, like if the past was infinite, it's possible that the past is infinite, premise one. It's possible that on each day God makes a finite number of hotel rooms ex nihilo and doesn't destroy any. And then it seems to follow that therefore Hilbert's Hotel would be possible now. But if a Hilbert's Hotel isn't possible now, one of those two premises has got to go. It's obvious that God could make those hotel rooms, right? So the thing that's got to go is the infinity of the past. That seems to be the type of argument. But then, as the reviewer pointed out, you can sort of turn that argument upside down and say, I mean, surely it's also within God's omnipotence to destroy without creating a finite number of hotel rooms on a given day, right? And if the future was endless, and he filled the future by constantly destroying but without creating hotel rooms, then there'd have to be an infinite hotel now to start with, right? Otherwise he'd run out of hotel rooms. He wouldn't be able to fill the future by doing that. And if we're supposing he doesn't ever build any new ones, then that entails now that there's a Hilbert's Hotel. So something's got to go there. But obviously God has that possibility because he's omnipotent. So he could destroy only a finite number of hotel rooms without building new ones. So the thing that's got to go is the infinite extent of the future. But presumably the defender of the Kalam is going to say something like, well, no, hold on a minute, you're pulling a fast one here, right? He only has that possibility if there's a Hilbert's Hotel now. But I think a Hilbert's Hotel is impossible. So obviously he doesn't have that possibility. He can't spend the whole of the future destroying hotel rooms without building any others, right? That's the problem. You're assuming something that makes a Hilbert's Hotel possible now. But that's exactly the response we make to the previous one, right? We're just saying, well, he doesn't have that possibility. If a Hilbert's Hotel is impossible, then God actually doesn't have the possibility, the ability to spend the whole of the past creating hotel rooms. right? Because there'd be a Hilbert same tail now. You can't have it both ways, right? So it feels like you can mirror that argument. Actually, it's not a clear case of an asymmetry. So what you have to do is not just turn it from the future tense to the past tense, but switch creating to destroying. And then you've got an actual mirror image argument. It works. It's like a yin and yang. It like matches perfectly. It's really cool.
It's a nice mirror, but Wes, are you convinced by that?
Well, it seems to me that the direction of causation might have something to do with this. I mean, to destroy a hotel room requires that the hotel room be there to be destroyed.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas, well, I don't know. I have to think more about that.
Yeah, so off the bat, I'm not persuaded by that response, but I mean, maybe if I think about it further, I'll come around to seeing that as like a good parallel argument. But I think it might have something to do with the fact that I have no problem admitting that it's possible for hotel rooms to be destroyed, but I do have hesitation admitting that it's possible for hotel rooms to be created ex nihilo.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if that's possible or not, but I mean, it's clearly possible that they could be destroyed. But I think that's why I kind of would like to put a little bit more pressure on the idea that they can be created ex nihilo.
Hold on 1 second.
Yeah, I think you did a good job with that in your paper.
Well, hopefully it's persuasive.
There's one thing I wanted to add before we move on. It has to do with the potential, thinking of the future as a domain of potentialities. Changing the vocabulary and talking about potentiality and actualization does nothing here. I mean, it'll just be the case that an actual infinity of potentialities, right, are such that each of them will be actualized. I mean, instead of saying each of infinitely many events will be, we'll say each of infinitely many potentialities will be actualized. And the number of such potentialities, ones that will be actualized, can't be zero. And if it's an endless series of potentialities that will be actualized one after another, then it has to be Aleph not. I mean, there's just no other possible answer. And that brings us back to the point about cardinality. I mean, the word the expression actually infinite is tricky because people may build other things having to do with their views about actualization and what's actual and how they use words like reality. But what we're claiming is that the number of future events, each of which will be, is, right, in the case of an endless series of them, is the same as the number of natural numbers. That's it. That's the claim. Now, we call that an actual infinite. Somebody else might want to build something extra into their concept of an actual infinite. Fine, let them do that. But you aren't in any way disputing our claim by building some extra thing about actuality or the actual, right, or the actual world into your definition of actual infinite.
Yeah. What they would be doing there is introducing a grammatical rule which says something like, I use the word actually infinite to mean that, or in circumstances when it refers to something that has that Cantorian property plus some other property that I like, you know, being concrete or being made of chocolate or whatever it is that they want to add on there, which is fine. But then you're not doing anything to actually address the point that we were making. Like adding on a grammatical rule about something else, that's fine, go for it. But that doesn't you know, that doesn't actually address it, because it's the if the Cantorian property is problematic, then the future has that. If it's endless, that's it. It's it doesn't matter if you dress it up as potentialities or anything else.
Exactly.
I think that's exactly right. I think also, if you imagine those marbles popping into existence, maybe the first one will have the number 1 written on it, and the second one will have the number 2 written on it. These numbers correspond to the numbers on the hotel rooms in Hilbert's Hotel. It's got to be the same number, because for every hotel room, the number on that hotel room is also going to be on a marble that will pop into existence. And Craig admits that one will pop into existence in the thought experiment. So I think you're right. The cardinality has to be equivalent.
Yeah, I think that's right. Okay, so
what's this terrible quantifier shift that that you're guilty of, Alex?
Well, okay, so shall I? Let me share my screen then. So I made operator shift. Yeah, modal quantifier shift. Well, I don't know. Yeah. So there was. Let me know when I'm sharing the screen. Is that coming through?
Not yet.
Not yet.
Or did I not choose? It says if it is.
We saw it before. It's.
Try again. Okay, is that working now? It's got the red outline on the screen now.
We're seeing your screen.
Okay, good. So here, let me press play on this thing. So are you getting this slide now?
Yeah,
okay. So this is Craig. So the question is it possible to count to infinity? So we're talking about something slightly different than well, not really, but it's a different way of putting the same sort of thing. Is it possible to count to infinity? Craig's emphatic answer is no to that, right? And here's a quote from his paper in the Blackwell Companion to Natural Theology with Sinclair. And he says, the impossibility of the formation of an actual infinite by successive addition seems obvious in the case of beginning at some point and trying to reach infinity. For given any finite number n plus 1 equals a finite number. Hence, Aleph naught has no immediate predecessor. It's not the terminus of the natural number series, but stands, as it were, outside and is the number of all of the members of the series. And then over the page, he says, one sometimes, therefore, speaks of the impossibility of counting to infinity, for no matter how many numbers one counts, one can always count one more number before arriving at infinity. One sometimes speaks instead of the possibility of traversing the infinite. The difficulty is the same. No matter how many steps one takes, the addition of one more step will not bring one to a point. Infinitely distant from one's starting point. So he's saying there that I take this to be a kind of no immediate predecessor argument, that infinity can't be reached by this kind of stepwise process because you need to reach a destination that doesn't have an immediate step just before it. So no matter how many steps you take, if all you're doing is taking steps, you're never going to arrive at a thing that doesn't have a step before it, right? If all you're doing is stating the number that comes immediately after the last one you've said, then you're never going to state a number that doesn't come immediately after any number. So that's the no immediate predecessor argument. And he says it, I think, even more clearly here. This is a quote from his book. Another way of seeing the point is by recalling that Aleph naught has no immediate predecessor. Therefore, one can never reach Aleph naught by successive addition or counting, since this would involve passing through an immediate predecessor to Aleph naught. And so here I've sort of marked out a collection, right, which is closed at the zero end and is open at the right-hand side. That's what the difference in brackets means. So it's just the natural numbers, right? And then just on the other side of that open bracket on the right-hand side comes Aleph naught. It's the first number that comes after all of the finite numbers. But there's no last finite number. There's no number that comes just before Aleph naught. So if you're counting, you'll always be stuck in that bracket that has an open end to it. And you'll never actually get out of that and traverse and be on the sunlit uplands of the transfinite numbers. You'll always be stuck on the kind of mortal plane of the finite numbers. Okay, fine. And I mean, for what it's worth, that argument, I don't have any problem with that. I don't think that you can do what Craig says you can't do. I agree with him. If you're just going to count forever, and if counting just means stating the immediate successor of the last thing you stated, then I think you're never going to make that transition from one thing to the other. And it seems to me that if that's right, then the consequence of that means that the future couldn't have a point that's like Aleph naught at it, right? It could be the future could have, that every point in the future could be finitely far away from the present, but there couldn't be a point in the future that was more than finitely far away from the present. And I think that's fair enough. Okay, in that sense, you can't count to infinity. I agree. But then here's Fred Dretske, and he actually has exactly the opposite answer and says, yes, you can count to infinity. And his argument is from this little paper in Analysis called Counting to Infinity. So it's 3 pages, so it's really easy to read. And he says, if George never stops counting, then he will count to infinity. If you take any number n, George will count n. Hence, for all finite numbers n, George will count n. Since there are an infinite number of finite numbers, we can say then that George will count to infinity in the sense that he will count each and every one of the finite numbers an infinite class. Now, I think I more or less made this argument. I was certainly, in my mind, trying to articulate Dretske's general point. And in reply to that, Craig said, I think, Alex, that this is a modal operator fallacy that I've seen in a number of times in your blogs. It's true that if the future is endless, that Cameron will be able to count every number in the future, but it does not follow from that he will count all the numbers in the future. So this is what you were saying a minute ago, Landon, that the first bit of that second sentence, it's true that if the future is endless, that Cameron will be able to count. So it will be able to. It's like a future operator and a modal operator, which seems an unnecessary modal operator there. I think the idea is just supposed to be that if the future is endless, that Cameron will count every number. That it doesn't follow from that he will count all the numbers. I take it that's what he's trying to say there. That the will be able to bit, the be able to doesn't actually do any work in that. I don't think he thinks that's crucial to stating the fallacy. He's just saying just because Cameron will count every number doesn't follow that Cameron will count all the numbers. And what's interesting is that if you put it like that, it's not a modal. It's not an instance of the pattern that he tried to illustrate with an example later on. So I think what he said later on was so here's this example, from the fact that every human being has a mother, it doesn't follow that there's a mother which every human being has. And that's an operator shift fallacy, right? So like in the top example, every human has a mother. So that's formalized as for all x, there is a y, such that x is the mother of y. And that picture at the top, which is just each of those circles, has a relation to the previous one, right? Like its mother, right? And each one has that relation to the previous one, and it's just a chain that goes on. And in that way, all of them are such that they have a mother, right? Each one has its own individual mother. But then the bottom one, which is there is a mother which every human being has, which is for all there is an x such that for all y, x is the mother of y. That's sort of pictured by the bottom picture, where there's some single mother to which everybody stands in the relation of that thing being their mother. Right? It's like the universal mother of everybody. I don't know, like Eve or something, I guess. But it obviously doesn't follow just from the fact that everyone has a mother, that there is some mother, a unique mother in particular, that's everybody's mother. So that would be a scope on a modal, that's not modal scope, a quantifier shift fallacy. So what's going on is that the formula has two quantifiers, universal and existential, and they switch their order round. Starts off universal existential in the top one, and then they switch around, it's existential universal in the bottom. And the idea is just you can't infer from universal existential down to existential universal. It doesn't work like that, right? Because you've got models like the top one, where the bottom one isn't also true of that model. So, okay, if that's the type of fallacy he's saying it is, you can understand how it might be like that, right? Because it would be like this. So take the top half of this picture. I'm just saying the same thing 3 times up there. But if you say, look, for all numbers, it will be that for all numbers x, it will be that Cameron counts x. Then you think of that as a universal quantifier with then a future tense operator, and then, you know, c of x just means counted or whatever. Cameron counts it. And the future tense operator is a bit like an x operator. So it's like saying for all numbers x, there is a future time at which Cameron is counting x. So that little model at the top, if we think of like where the now is, just before each of those dots, there is a future time where Cameron says 0, there's another future time where he says 1, there's another future time where he says 2, etc. So it's saying for all numbers, there is a time where that number is said. And then the bottom one, which would be the shift where we change places with the operators, it will be that Cameron counts all the numbers, right? It will be the case that for all x, Cameron counts x. That's like saying there's a future time at which Cameron counts all the numbers, right? So in that model there, it's just like saying pick some future time, and at that time, he enumerates all of the numbers. Like, I don't know, at the same time, instantaneous. I don't know what it means for someone to count all the numbers simultaneously, but that's what it's saying. And obviously the first one doesn't imply the second one, right? Like, just because there's some individual time for each number where that number is said, it doesn't mean that there's some unique time where all of the numbers are said, right? So if that was what I was saying, then it would be fallacious, right? If Craig was diagnosing this type of modal operator shift in my blog posts or whatever, and that I'm constantly doing this, and I think he would be right, because I think that that's a fallacy. I mean, obviously is a fallacy, right? You can just see by looking at the picture that something's true of the top model that isn't true of the bottom one. But I think you've got to just sort of, you know, you can hear someone make an argument and then cook up a formalization of that that's invalid, and that's super easy to do. And you can be uncharitable and just say someone's making a fallacy here and just cook up a way of showing a fallacy. But what you've got to do is actually think about whether that's the best or strongest way of stating, even if they misspeak and say something wrong, whether that's the right way, the best way to state the argument. Like, is there a better way of stating it? And I'm not clear. I'm certainly not clear. I mean, maybe I said it wrong, right? Maybe even Dretsky's quote that I gave before says it wrong or something. But I think first of all, Craig says it in a way that doesn't involve this type of fallacy, right? So go back to what he said, right? He said, I think Alex, a modal operator fallacy, blah, 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 blah. It's true that if the future is endless, that Cameron will, let's forget that we'll be able to, but he'll count every number in the future. It doesn't follow from that he will count all the numbers in the future. So, you know, think of number one, Cameron will count every number in the future. Therefore, Cameron will count all the numbers in the future. Now, what we're not there's, for one thing, the future tense and quantifier are in the same place in 1 and 2, right? The will count comes before the quantifier both times there. The only thing that's different between them, it's not a modal scope distinction. It's that we've got every and all, right? It's just that we've got two different notions of quantification that are going on there. And I spoke to a friend of mine who's a logician and who is very knowledgeable about medieval logic, and she was impressing upon me the idea that modern logic is somewhat clumsy at distinguishing between these words like every, or each, and all, and scope distinctions do something, but they don't always capture it in the right way, and that there are inferences that we can express in English that we don't often formalize very well just by using classical or semi-classical logic, and that the medievals were much more nimble at expressing some of these distinctions, and we've forgotten some of the nuance that in the way that they do it. And I'm not an expert in medieval logic, so I'm not going to sit here and now explain something about medieval logic, but it was intriguing to me, and it made me think and sit down and look at this more. And I think so. I now like this distinction between distributive predication and collective predication, which is this is a medieval idea. But look, so you could say every item is $5, right? And you can hear that as meaning each one of those costs $5. So if you bought all three of those items and took them to the till, the cashier would ring it through and they'd ask you to pay $15, right? That's what it means, that every item is $5. So that's predication that distributes the thing. The predicate $5 distributes over each one of the entities in the collection, and that's why it costs $15 if you get all three of them. And in contrast to that, you can have this collective predication where you'd say all items are $5, and you could hear that to mean that, you know, taking all three of the items up to the till, they'll charge you just $5, right? The whole collection costs $5. That's what it means to say all of the items are $5. So that's the distinction between distributive predication, where you'll say you have got a predicate and you apply it to each item in the collection individually, and collective predication, where you've got your predicate and you apply it to the whole thing, right? The collection collectively. And obviously, you know, in that case, you can see not each. So when Craig's saying this is a fallacy, you're inferring from every to all, that sometimes that's invalid, because sometimes, you know, it costs $15, sometimes it costs $5, right? So it shows you that every and all in this sense don't always have the same consequences. So you shouldn't infer all just because you've got an every statement. And that's right. So sometimes it's invalid, but then, you know, consider this case, right? Every item is in the shop, right? So let's distributively apply that predicate, right? The loo roll is in the shop, the chocolate bar is in the shop, the roses are in the shop, right? But actually that just means the same as saying all the items are in the shop, right? If I apply collective predication to that, that has the same output, right? That just there's a shop, all three things are in it, right? That's what it means. So sometimes every to all inferences are truth preserving because they mean the same thing, and sometimes they're not, right? So just saying, oh, you've got an instance of every to all, you've got an instance of an inference which is from every to all, therefore that's a fallacy, is not enough to show that there's anything actually wrong with that specific case that you've got. This is why I was asking Craig to say you need to do more than just point to a fallacy and say that's a fallacy. You actually have to show me why in this case, what I was talking about is one of those ones where the premise can be true, but the conclusion can't be, right? And he didn't do anything to do that. He sort of said, well, it's like you can't turn a potential infinite into an actual infinite or something, but that's not, he didn't show me clearly how it works. And I don't, you know, so let me show you that I think it works like this, right? You can say Cameron will count every number, right? That in the distributive predication sense. So you're just applying the predicate will count to each and every number. So 0 will be counted, 1 will be counted, 2 will be counted, 3 will be counted, right? And just apply that to every one of them. And then think about the bottom where Cameron will count all the numbers as a collective predication. It just seems to me that actually in the top case, it is, you know, those are going to be a case where when the top one's true, the bottom one's true as well. Like, how could it be not? Right? I mean, that's not a great argument, but like, I look at the picture. How could it be that the top picture holds, but the bottom picture doesn't? I mean, what would it take for that to be the case? I can't see it. So it's not like, I mean, if I go back a few slides, this was a case where something in the top holds, but the bottom doesn't. This was the case where, well, when the top holds, the bottom one does as well. And if you ask yourself, well, which of these two is the Cameron counting case more like? It just seems obvious to me that it's more like the second one than the first one. If Craig thinks that it's obvious the other direction, I'd ask why. What's the thing that shows you that, right? That points in exactly the opposite direction to my intuition. And it's not like, you know, where's the fallacy? So anyway, sorry, I'm going on a bit here. I didn't mean to go on so long, but so one thing is, so what I'm trying to say so far is there's a modal scope operator shift fallacy thing, whatever you want to call it. But it's not clear that that's what I was saying, or that I need to say that. And it seems like when Craig summarized what I was saying, he didn't actually put it in terms of an operator shift fallacy. He put it in terms of an every to all inference. And clearly they're not all invalid. And it seems to me quite plain that the relevant one here that we're looking at right now isn't one of the ones where the premise is true and the conclusion isn't. So that, you know, what's the problem? If that's how to think about it, what's the problem? I'm still wondering what the problem is supposed to be. But I think even then we could let's just say that they're all invalid. Even though this picture seems conclusive to me, I don't think I need to say Cameron will count all the numbers. I don't think that even matters. And here's the last thing I want to say, right? So right at the top, I've got this principle that seems to me a tautology almost, right? That if a predicate P applies distributively in the distributive sense to every element in a collection, then the number of things in that collection, which are P, is the same as the number of things in that collection, right? So if the predicate applies to all of to each and every thing, then if you counted them, you'd just find that each and every one of them had the property, right? So here's think of the green argument, right? Like there are 3 items, every item is in the shop, right? So the first premise, there are 3 items, that enumerates the number of things in the collection. Then premise 2 is your distributive predication, right? Every item is in the shop. It just follows logically then that there are 3 items in the shop, right? There are 3 items, every one of them is in the shop, therefore there are 3 items in the shop. Like obviously that follows. Then the red box, it doesn't matter, so it seems to me, if you change it to be infinitely many, say there are infinitely many items, every item is in the shop, therefore there are infinitely many items in the shop. Like obviously that follows. Like what's the problem there? How is that a fallacy? And then to bring it back to the real point here, you could say there are infinitely many natural numbers, which I think is something Craig admits, in that non-ontologically committing sense of using his quantifiers. But he does think there are infinitely many finite numbers, infinitely many natural numbers. And he agreed, it seemed, that the premise that Cameron will count each of them if he counts now and never stops, then it just follows that how many of them there are, such that each will be counted by Cameron, is infinitely many. It's as close to a logically watertight argument as I think I could possibly manage to make to express this point. And it just patently doesn't. The arguments presented in the yellow and blue box, which are just rewordings of the same thing, they obviously don't suffer from a modal operator shift, and they don't even suffer from an each or every to all inference. They don't use that. They just have they just use every. They only use one quantifier. So yeah. Anyway, I sat down and did that this afternoon. So it might not be the clearest thing in the world, but yeah. Okay. Sorry. So how does that strike you guys? I'll stop sharing my screen now.
It strikes me as obviously correct. Yeah, I think what Craig is, I think he's confusing something that is actually a fallacy with your reasoning, which is not a fallacy. And so the unfortunate thing is, I think you use this example in the conversation, which I hear as a fallacy, which is I can eat each slice in the loaf of bread, therefore I can eat the entire loaf. And I think that, yeah, that is a fallacy to say just because you can eat each slice, therefore you can eat the entire loaf. But this is not a fallacy. I will eat each slice in the loaf, therefore I will eat the entire loaf. That strikes me as not a fallacy, and I think that Craig is actually getting confused between those two things. Yeah, so that's my initial. I have other examples we could talk about, but what do you think, Wes?
That seems right to me. Going back over Alex's presentation, I guess I think in English we aren't that clear about the distinction between every and all. We do this distributive predication thing. And I think when we want to make it really clear, we say each of them, right? So each of the items in the shop is $5. And if we wanted to say that it's $5 for all of them, that's what we would say. We would say, right, if you want to buy all of them, it's $5. I don't think we'd be likely to say all of them are $5, that is a little bit ambiguous, but would probably be heard as saying that each of them has a price tag of $5. Um, this is not an important point, not a philosophically important point. It's just about my ear for English. I think English is not always clear, and every and all can be, it can be distributive, it can be distributive, or it can be ambiguous, which it is. And there are various ways to disambiguate it. What we did in the paper that we co-wrote was repeatedly to use the each of construction. So we would say things like, each of the numbers will be counted.
Yeah.
But each of the events will occur. Now, of how many is it the case that it will occur? And when you put it that way, there is obviously no operator shift fallacy going on. And there certainly is no fallacy of, every man has a mother, therefore the humanity as a whole has a mother. It's a perfectly straightforward argument. And the way Alex laid it out in the last slide seems to me to be exactly correct. And so I'm at a loss to understand why Craig, who said he read our paper, would not have understood what we were saying. I mean, it seems to me to have been perfectly clear.
I will say.
Go. No, you go.
Oh, I was going to say, I did see another YouTube video a couple of days ago where I think that the people, they were responding to your debate, and I think they were saying you can't do any kind of parts to whole reasoning when it comes to infinity, right? Like parts to whole reasoning is always fallacious when it comes to infinity. I think that that's what they were saying. I hope I didn't get that wrong. But that, that sort of thing just seems wrong to me as well. And maybe this is relevant to this composition fallacy stuff. Seems to me parts to whole reasoning is sometimes good, and when it's good, it's also good when it comes to infinite contexts. So you might say, well, every atom in this water bottle is invisible, therefore the water bottle is invisible, and it's not. That's bad reasoning. That's the composition fallacy. But every floor tile is red, therefore the entire floor is red, would not be a fallacy. And you could just do that for the Hilbert's Hotel, the floor in the Hilbert's Hotel. Every floor tile is red, therefore the entire floor in Hilbert's Hotel is red. So parts to whole reasoning like that sometimes is okay. And it's okay in finite context, it's okay in infinite context, and probably it just doesn't matter anyway, as you said, because what Craig wants to say in response to you is Cameron will not count all of the numbers. And I think that if you hear that as Cameron will not finish counting all the numbers, there's no time at which Cameron has counted all of the numbers, then that's obviously true. There's no time where he's going to finish it, but that's not the claim that you're making. And so I think that that's where this is getting ambiguous. Maybe I'll just get one intuition from you, and then I see what you think. Think about I will eat each slice in the loaf, therefore I will eat the entire loaf. If you imagine it's a Hilbert's loaf with an infinite number of slices, and you'll eat one each minute forever. So it seems to me that if I will eat each slice, therefore I will eat the entire loaf, that seems right to me. But when I ask other people, I asked my wife, for example, and the way it sounds to her, and I imagine to a lot of people, is it's false to say I will eat the entire loaf, because I think we read into it, there will be a time at which I've completed the eating of the loaf.
Yeah, that's my intuition.
Yeah, so if that's the way you hear it, then obviously you're going to say that that's wrong. But there's another way of hearing it where you say, I will eat each slice, therefore I'll eat the whole thing, where just think about it like this. What is it to eat the entire loaf? It's to eat every portion of the loaf, right? But when I say I will eat each slice, that is just to say I will eat each portion, every portion of the loaf, right?
This is a Hilbert's loaf we're talking about.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. So I don't know. But in any case, how many slices are in the loaf? An actually infinite number of slices, right? Each of which I will eat, which is the point I think that you're making, right?
Yeah, the thing I want to say about that is it feels like the difficult conjunction is to hold, and this requires, I think, sort of learning how to, like we heard the sentence, all the items are $5. And there's two ways of hearing it. It's like a duck rabbit. You can hear it as meaning each of them as a distributive predication, but you can also hear it as a collective predication. You just have to kind of like tune in to hearing it that way round. So I think that it takes skill to understand how I will eat each slice in the loaf can be logically compatible with I will never finish eating the loaf. Right, that those two things, and that then in that sense, I will eat the whole loaf is logically compatible with I will never finish eating the loaf. That those two things can be held together at the same time. And what you have to do is duck rabbit the sentence I will eat the whole loaf out of the idea that there's a point where I'm finishing and I've stopped, and that we are commonly used to hearing things like, so I was talking about this as the simple to perfect inference, where you're going to say something like, it will be that P entails it will have been that P. And that most of the time that's true. Like if I will drink this glass of water, then there'll be a point after that where I've done it and it's over. And I can say I have drunk the glass of water. And most of the time we can apply that pattern of inference, but it doesn't apply universally, right? It doesn't apply in the case where time comes to an end, right? Because think about the thing that happens at the very last moment of time, right? Like say God sends an angel down and he plays a note on a saxophone that no one's ever heard before, some like angelic final note that no one's ever played before, some amazing note or something. For every time in the universe before that happens, it's true that the angel will play that saxophone note. And there isn't a point after that. It's the final thing that happens. So there'll never be a point where you can say he has played the saxophone note. So it's true that he will play the saxophone note, but it's false that he will have played the saxophone note, right? Because there's never a point after that where you can look back at it. So that inference from will to will have fails. And that's got nothing to do with infinity, right? Because I'm assuming that the time comes to an end, that it's finite. So all that it takes for that inference to fail is that you don't have a point that follows the subject of your future tense statement, right? So that fails in that finite context. But then it's interesting once you learn that to look at an infinite future that's filled with doing something like eating slices of bread or saying praises to God or counting numbers. As long as what you're doing fills the future, then that gives you the fact that you don't have a time that follows all of them, that you can look back on it and say, well, that's over now. It has happened, right? So that stops the will have been inference coming in. But it's not just because it's infinite. It's because you don't have that perspective on future perspective on it from which you can look back, right? So diagnosing it as a problem that's generated by infinity is to miss the subtle point. Because if it was just a problem that was generated by infinity, then that saxophone example would, fails to be accounted for by the analysis, right? The proper analysis is actually that it's not infinity that's causing the problem. So again, and I think this is something that often comes up, and Oppie has a nice line about this, where he says something like, I can tell a story that's inconsistent about getting into a taxi, right? But that doesn't mean getting into a taxi is impossible, right? You have to diagnose the right thing in a story that's impossible. And it doesn't, just because it involves infinity, you don't have to blame infinity, or just because it involves an infinite past doesn't mean you have to blame the infinite past. We have to make sure that the analysis is actually diagnosing the correct culprit. And it seems to me that this is one way, or a quite profitable way of approaching these paradoxes of infinity. Is a lot of the time something else is what's going wrong. It's not actually infinity that's the problem. Yeah.
If we get back to Hilbert's loaf for a minute, I think I'm in the camp that says it's not true that you will eat the whole loaf. I don't know what that means. If it means you will have eaten the whole loaf, then of course it doesn't follow from the fact that each slice will be eaten by you that you will have eaten the whole loaf. If it means there will be a time at which you are eating all the slices of the loaf, that doesn't follow either.
Mm-hmm.
So I will eat the whole loaf. Maybe that's just a misleading way of saying each of the slices is such that it will be eaten by me. If that's so, then yeah, I'll eat the whole loaf. But here's a better way to say it with the word each. That's my reaction to that. But of course, the essential point for us here is that this, each of them will be to the whole of the thing will have been, or the whole thing will be, is not a feature of the argument that Alex was giving.
That's right.
It has, let's say that is a fallacy, but it's not a fallacy that Alex is committing.
Right. So, because if you say, if the interlocutor grants that you will eat each slice, you can just stop right there and say, okay, so how many slices am I going to eat then? And if it's a Hilbert's loaf, the only answer is infinitely many, right?
And at this point, this is the point at which Craig always says, you will never eat all of them.
Yeah. But that's why I'm saying stop, but pause on premise one and just say, if each of them, how many is such that each of them will be eaten? Let's say it's also true that I won't eat all of them. It's just how many is true such that I'll eat each of them? That seems to be it. That's all you need.
Okay. Well, let me actually press back on that a little bit. Not on the Hilbert's loaf thing, but so what you're saying is, in Dretske's sense, you can count to infinity. And what Craig is saying is, what he's going to say is, you will never count an actually infinite number. And it sounds like he's saying you will never finish a count. Just like when I say you will never eat the entire loaf, it sounds like you're saying you'll never finish eating the entire loaf. At least that's the way I hear it. But suppose that he says, okay, in Dretske's sense, you can count to infinity, and you will, and suppose he says the obvious thing, which is the number of counts that you have is actually infinite. That's the only answer you can give there. However, by virtue of the fact that there will never be a time at which you've counted more than a finite number, is that really an example where you are forming an actual infinite by successive addition? Because it seems like Craig is going to say, yeah, but you never form the actual infinite in that way, because to form the actual infinite is kind of like to complete it, to have that end point, right? It's to finish the count. And so his whole point is to say you can't form an actual infinite by successive addition. And I don't see whether Dretske's argument actually allows you to do that.
Okay, so I think, so I want to say something like this, right? So I had a quick conversation with Josh Rasmussen after the discussion as well. And he said, I think he was talking to his kid, it's like 5-year-old kid, about this. And he does that, like asking them questions to test their intuitions, which is quite cool, I think. But so I think it was like this. He said, can you climb out of an infinitely deep hole, right? And that was the question. Now, it seems to me that if I'm at the bottom of an infinitely deep hole, looking up, it can be true that I'll climb each bit of the the infinitely high wall in front of me. But my intuition is I'll never actually get out, right? I don't see myself like climbing out at the end, because there kind of isn't an end to climb out of, one thing. But like, so it feels to me like I want to say, well, I'll climb every bit of I will climb each bit of the wall, but I'll never climb out of the hole. That seems false there. But now take a different type of infinitely deep hole, right? One which doesn't have a bottom, right? And it does have a top, and I'm scaling up towards the top. And you say to me, will you climb out of that hole? And I say, yeah, I definitely will. Like at some finite time in the future, I will climb out that hole. So can you climb out of an infinitely deep hole has a different answer depending on whether or not it has a beginning or an end. And that makes a difference here. So it feels like the Dretske, all the Dretske case is doing is saying, firstly, it's saying that no immediate predecessor argument is irrelevant to this, because there is a sense of starting at zero and counting to infinity, and that's Dretske's one. And the no immediate predecessor one doesn't actually block that. And then when you come to look at the counting down from infinity, or climbing out of an infinitely deep hole that has a top on it, then the no immediate predecessor argument is relevant as well there, right? Because it's not like you have to assume that you started off counting a number that doesn't have an immediate successor, because how could you ever do that, right? So you don't have to assume that happened. It doesn't have to be a bit of the whole that's more than finitely far away, right? So it just feels like part of the Dretske point is just to point out the complete irrelevance to the dialectic of Craig saying Aleph naught doesn't have an immediate predecessor, because that's got nothing to do with either counting up to infinity in a relevant sense or counting down from infinity. It's just it doesn't play a role in either of those thoughts. So for me, it's not like a direct rebuttal to what he's saying. I kind of agree that you can't count to Aleph naught. But what I'm saying is the relevant sense of counting to infinity, it feels like, in that sense, starting at zero and counting upwards, feels like you can count to infinity. And I suppose you're pushing back saying, but is that forming an infinite by successive addition? That was the pushback, right?
Yeah, so I think what Craig is going to say, you can't do that. I mean, doing that is totally possible, but it doesn't actually form an actual infinite because it's always finite. So that's why he's going to push back and say you're just counting endlessly and it's not forming an actual infinite. But I think you're exactly right. It's just that this doesn't matter anyway, because the relevant issue is whether you could count down from infinity given an eternal past, right? I think that gets rid of the no immediate predecessor worry all by itself. I don't even think you need Dretske's argument to do that, right?
Yeah, you might be right about that. I suppose you can just sort of cut out that bit of the dialectic, I guess.
It seems to me the connection between Dretske's argument and the successive addition argument is this. The future series of events is formed by successive addition because each will be added to those that have gone before. So in that sense of formed by successive addition, it's a clear counterexample to the central claim of the argument from successive addition, which is that an infinite series can't be formed by successive addition. Now, the response to that is, well, but you can never get to the end, or you can't get to Aleph naught, or you can't have counted infinitely many. Well, in that case, it sounds to me as if something extra is being put into the definition of formed by successive addition. A series can't be formed by successive addition unless it has been completed. I guess that's the assumption. But then who says that an infinite, right? Why are we to think that an infinite series can't have been completed? The argument that they always give is to start out with an endless series and say you can't get to the end of it, then generalize from that to the claim that an infinite series can't be completed by successive addition, and then apply that general claim to a beginningless past. That's the way the dialectic usually goes. And, I mean, at bottom, The only thing that's going on here is that people are saying you can't get to the end of an infinite series because it doesn't have an end. So you can't get to the end of a beginningless series because it doesn't have a beginning.
Yeah.
And when you put it that way, it just doesn't follow. That one thing that bothers me about Dretschke's argument has to do not with the argument, but with the presentation. I think it's a little bit misleading to call this counting to infinity. When I hear the expression counting to infinity, it really does sound like counting and counting and counting and getting to infinity. And that isn't what he's talking about. You know, what he's talking about is counting to infinity in the sense of, right, each of the infinitely many steps will be taken, right? But that isn't what we normally hear when we hear the expression counting to infinity.
Yeah, so it's like saying when you count to 10, you would expect to hear 10 in the counting. And then it's weird when people count to 10 and they go 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. I've done it. And you say, well, hold on, you haven't said 10. You go, I have said 10 numbers though, right? So it's in that sense of like cardinality. You know, you said 10 numbers. If you start at 0, you don't actually say 10, right? But we're hearing it as an ordinal number. I want to hear the 10th number, and I expect that to be 10. You know, that I expect you to say that sound. So I think in that sense, you know, Dretschke's, that's how I hear it. You know, I can do counting events such that there's infinitely many of them, and that is the thing that Craig thinks you can't do, because that's what the guy who's just finished counting down has just done counting events such that infinitely many of them have just finished, right? But in a cardinality sense, not an ordinality sense, he doesn't have to be saying a number that doesn't have a predecessor or something, because he's basically saying -1 or 0 or something, which does have an immediate predecessor. So like it does. I don't know. I'm not sure I've got the
If
the
you
right
just
way
say
of
each of
stating this.
infinitely many will be counted, then nobody can accuse you of being confused and thinking that you can count all the way to infinity and say infinity right after its immediate predecessor. No one will think you're saying that.
Yeah.
But
Yeah,
still,
like
oh, go ahead.
no, go.
I was going to say, but it just still feels like I agree with everything you just said there, but it still feels like Craig is just going to say you can count infinitely, and that is successive addition, but you're not forming an actual infinite collection by doing the count, right? Because there's no point at which you move from finite to infinite. So that's the only thing I think he's worried about when he makes this argument. Now, I think that he needs more than that. I think your point, Wes, is that he needs more than that to rule out a beginningless past.
Yeah, he needs to forget the endless future and saying that you can never get to the end of it, right? He needs to forget that part and just go straight to showing us that a beginningless past is impossible. Why is that?
Well, the endless future one is supposed to be your intuition pump to get you onto the side of thinking it's impossible.
But my intuition tells me that I can't count all the way to infinity. Fine. What is that supposed to tell me about whether I can have counted infinitely many numbers?
And I think Craig changes the subject to some extent when he explains that, because he starts saying things like, well, the problem with the infinite past is that before this moment happened, the previous one had to happen, and then before that one, the one before that had to happen. And then he says you're driven back like a herd of sheep by some sheepdog or something, further and further into the past. I never know what that driven back thing is supposed to mean. Like, who's driving what? Like, I don't understand what that means. But he thinks that you could never arrive at the present or something because the previous one would have to happen first. But I think, like you've said this in print a couple of times before, it's like, but so what? Like that's the hypothesis. Yeah. So what's wrong with that hypothesis?
Well,
You can just state
nice...
the bits of the hypothesis, right?
Before each of them happens, all the others have happened. That's a good explication of what a beginningless series would be. How does it follow from that the present couldn't arrive?
Yeah, that's like saying the present could never set off on an infinite future, because after this moment, another one would have to happen.
People who give the successive addition argument always talk about traversing the infinite, as if there were someone or something that was tasked with traversing the infinite. And I just find this all very strange. We don't have to have something or someone who is doing this. The hypothesis of a beginningless past is just that before any time, there's another time. There was another time. And before that, there was another time. Before this event, there was another. Before these two events, there was another. For every event in, there was another in, I don't know, +1 or -1, whichever way we choose to represent it, right? There was another one. What is all this with traversing? As if someone had a task to perform and was, I mean, it always sounds like Achilles in the stadium paradox. And Craig actually, in his writing, embraces this. You know, how Achilles, before he can take one step, a single step, he has to take half of that step. And before he can take a half, he has to take a... Craig says, yeah, that's just how it is here with the beginningless past, except that, they're all steps of equal length. But this is a completely different scenario. I mean, we're not looking for a starting point, because the hypothesis we're talking about is not one that involves a starting point. It's not that we can't get started on this infinite task of traversing all of the infinitely many units of past time.
Yeah, I agree.
I think there's another way of putting the argument, which is that it's something like, if the present, the moving now, had to traverse an infinite past to get here. So you could sort of think about it as like a car driving along an infinitely long road. And the intuition they're trying to say is, and that we're at some point on the road. The intuition is that it's never going to get to you, because the car has to have, something like, I can't say this properly because it sounds like, when I say it out loud, it sounds like a category error or something, but like it would take too long to get there or something, right? Like there's not enough time for the car to have traversed all of that distance to get to you. But then you start thinking, well, the road was a metaphor for time anyway. So like you're asking how long it takes the moving now to pass through time to get here. Like I kind of feel like the A theory doesn't really make sense because of this double counting time passing. Like you're talking about like the distance it covers or something, but speed is distance over time. And if the distance is an analogy for time, what's the time thing in this? Which is time over time. And then it just feels like the moving now has to pass at a rate of 1. One what? Like, and how could it be different? And so it just, there's something about the A theory, just it feels to me like it doesn't make any sense, right? I can talk in terms of tenses, if that's, the ontology is supposed to be tenses are the basic feature of reality. But when we actually start picturing this moving now and temporal progression being real, I find it very difficult to understand what's going on there, right?
There was one point in your debate with Craig in which he seemed to embrace that way of talking, the moving now, or the now, how did he put it? Designating one event at a time. I think that's something. Isn't that what he said? Designates?
Something like that, yeah.
One moment at a time. That didn't seem to me to be the sort of position that he would want to take, because his view is that the present moment is a creation of new events, new stuff, right? Which then immediately ceases to be. And so it's not that there are all these events arrayed out there and then the moving now moves across them, as in the moving spotlight theory, that version of the A theory. His version of the A theory is one in which, the present moment is a moment of creation of new stuff coming into existence, I should say. New stuff just coming into existence.
Right.
And then it immediately ceases to be. So why couldn't it have been the case that for each of infinitely many past events, each of those events has come into existence and immediately ceased to be? I'm really not seeing the problem.
That's right. I think if he tries to move from that presentist sort of motif of thinking about the present as being a kind of creation and destruction of events as they come and go or whatever, and moves towards this successively the now is a sort of term that successively designates different locations on the timeline as a kind of moving spotlight theory, which is a kind of combination of eternalism, which is to say that all times exist, and the A theory, which is to say that temporal passage is real or something, becoming is real. So it's a bit of a weird hybrid view, this moving spotlight view. But it seems to me the problem with that comes back to that double counting time problem I was saying a moment ago, which is you say something like, if Craig wants to adopt that verbiage of successively designating different events or something, because I'm going to say something like, when does the now point designate, say, the armistice of World War One? When does it designate that? And the only answer can be, well, in November 19 or 1918, whenever World War One ended. That's when the moving now designated that point. And when, and then you get this kind of triviality to it. And in fact, you just end up saying that each event, the moving now designates each event at that event, right? And then it just sort of collapses into just eternalism without the moving spotlight, right? Like each event is because you're double counting again. Like you have to ask, when is a location on the timeline designated? And that only makes sense if you treat the timeline as a space and then superimpose an idea of time moving. But the timeline is supposed to be time. It's only a spatial analogy for time. If you bring in moving time on top of a spatialized representation of time, you've got two times going on at in the same rate, and then it just collapses in on itself. So it just feels to me like Craig's in for a world of pain if he's going to move to a moving spotlight theory, because then there's all these other types of arguments that make it even more difficult, right? Moving spotlight theory is incoherent, it seems to me. But we are getting wildly off the topic that we were supposed to be talking about. Did we want? I know we've been talking for a while. I mean, did we want to say anything about the last bit, which is about the principle of sufficient reason, and Craig's argument for thinking that the counter couldn't be finishing his countdown now rather than at some other time? Did either of you want to say anything about that in particular?
Well, what happened there is that you pointed out the fallaciousness of the argument, and he then replaced it with a quite different argument. And what he said was that initial argument was just a foray into the territory, instead of saying, well, you're right, that argument is fallacious. Here's another one that isn't. The fallacious one, maybe you can state it, Alex. The fallacious one is, well, if he's had enough time to have counted all the numbers at every time, so he must always already have counted all the numbers. So there's no time at which he is finishing his count, contrary to the hypothesis of the infinite, eternal past infinite counter. Isn't that it? I mean,
Yeah.
it's not a crisp statement, but
let's see if I can say it, because I might not be able to do any better. Let's see if it was like, so you come across this guy who's kind of counting down, going 3, 2, 1, 0, I finished, or whatever, and then the worry here is it's nothing to do with no immediate predecessor or whatever. It's just something like that couldn't happen because before he said 2, if you asked how many numbers has he said at that point, the answer is he's already said infinitely many numbers. And then Craig always says, so he should have finished his count already by then. And what's weird about that should is it's like, do you mean that...
He means would.
Yeah, so it seems like he's saying that there's a sufficient condition is present for the finishing, right? Like, and so it's almost like that it would entail that he finishes at that point already.
He says explicitly that having had sufficient time to complete the count is sufficient for completing it.
Yeah, and then so I pointed out that, like, well, if you look at the conditional...
Well, it's not.
Yeah, exactly. I said, like, so, I mean, if you've spent forever counting down, then you're finishing your count now, doesn't sound right. Whereas if you say, if I'm finishing my infinite countdown now, then I've been spending, I've done infinitely many counts already. That does sound right. So it shows you that, like, the one of them's a necessary condition, the other one's a sufficient condition. Like, that's the relationship, and he's got it the wrong way round. And I said it to him like that, and he said, oh, yeah. And he actually said, I'm not suggesting that you think it's a sufficient condition, as if, like, I was diagnosing the mistake with my own argument, and he was agreeing with me that would have been a bad argument. And don't get me wrong, Alex, I'm not saying you're making such a terrible argument. And I was like, wait, what? How did the burden shift around so much? Am I making Craig's argument? Am I defending Craig's bad argument? And he's saying, don't worry there, poor boy, you're not so stupid to think that. And I was like taken aback by it. But listening back to it just the other day, I was like, whoa, how did that happen? It's his argument. And then a second later, he then rephrases it and says something like, I just don't know what else there is that you would need to finish your countdown, apart from there being infinitely many counting events previously. And it was just like, so wait, hold on. Now you're saying that it is a sufficient condition. Right? Like, what else would you need? That's just to say that it's sufficient to do it. And I just explained, and it seemed like he agreed, that it isn't a sufficient condition. It's a necessary but insufficient condition for finishing the countdown. So I think he's confused about that. It's weird. It's like he's slipped between saying it in different ways. And it seems crystal clear to me, and I can't explain how he could be confused about that, because it's such an elementary point. But his response back it felt to me like trying to catch hold of a slippery fish. I couldn't quite grasp where it was going next. It was bizarre. I don't know. What do you think about that, Landon?
I don't think I have much to add. I haven't really thought a whole lot about this argument. I think I agree with the viewpoint that you and Wes take on this argument. What Craig is asking for is an explanation for why the countdown is ending right now. And
that's the
seems to
backup
me,
argument.
Oh, okay, yeah. So when he moves to that, it seems to me that there's like an obvious explanation you can give that's not going to be satisfactory, and so then you're just in the neighborhood of trying to figure out, what kind of explanation does Craig think that is required. And so I think maybe we could turn to that, because I don't think I have anything. I think you're just right. I don't see why that would be a sufficient condition. The fact that there has been an infinite amount of time, just because you can put the intervals of time and the counting of the numbers into one-to-one correspondence, doesn't mean that that's where they were on the count. The way you did it. So they could be anywhere on the count, it seems to me. So should we turn to the sufficient reason, the explanation part of it?
Sure.
Well, I think, Wes, you've thought about this more than Craig has. because I think your challenge to me over the last couple of weeks on this, or months, has makes it seem like you've got your head around it more than he does, because he just seemed. I asked him. So just to set the scene, then I think that Craig says something like, "There's just no possible reason." No possible explanation. I guess no possible reason why he'd be finishing his countdown now rather than at some other time. And so there's this stuff about like, well, what is an explanation? What type of thing do you mean by that? And in the most recent literature he's written on this, he is sparring with Graham Oppy, and Oppy has this like weak version of the principle of sufficient reason where it's just a partial explanation, right? Not a whatever the opposite of a partial explanation, a complete or ultimate explanation or something. So he's saying that, while those really ambitious versions of the principle of sufficient reason suffer from this modal collapse thing, if you just have sorry, did I say weak? The strong versions of the principle of sufficient reason suffer from modal collapse. You might come up with a weaker version where it's just like a partial explanation for each contingent event, and then that doesn't suffer from modal collapse. And he's saying, well, maybe something like that would be more plausible. And then Craig says, okay, well, here's a version that fits your schema. Every contingent event has a partial explanation. And then he says, that's plausible. I think that's plausible, but how even that plausible schema, right? There's not even a partial explanation for why the guy's finishing his countdown now. And I asked him, well, what do you mean by partial explanation? Because I can give what seems like a partial explanation. 2 minutes ago, I still had 2 numbers to count, and I count up 1 number per minute, right? That explains why I finished now rather than like last year or something. And he just sort of laughed and said that I should.
That kicks the can down the road.
Yeah. And he also said the readers should consult his paper for what he means by partial, but he doesn't say what. I mean, I read closely that bit of the paper over and over again. He does not say what he means by partial. He just kicks the can himself over to Oppy, right? Oppy read that bit closely too. He says, let's pretend we have a notion of partiality that's clear here. He doesn't try and define it. And the only thing he does say is this notion of partiality seems to be implicit in Craig 1979, which is Craig's book on the Kalam, right? And I went to see that. I think, oh, great, maybe Craig has some definition of partiality in terms of explanation. And he doesn't. He doesn't actually mention the word at all, because I've got an electronic copy. So I did a Control F, had a little search through. He doesn't have a definition. So there's can kicking, ironically, and it goes back to a point where there's no explanation for what the term partial means. So I don't know what he's asking for. I still feel like I don't know, but I was giving a sort of a can-kicking explanation, and I think you don't like that, Wes. You don't think that that's going to work, right?
Well, I think the question he's asking is, why is he finishing now rather than at some previous time, given that at the previous time, he already had enough time to have finished.
Mm-hmm.
So why is he finishing now rather than at some previous time? Isn't that the question? And what he's saying, I mean, I don't know what he means by partial explanation, but he's saying that there is no good answer to that question. There's no conceivable answer to that question. No good answer, no conceivable answer, no explanation at all.
But then, sound right? Say I give you some explanation like 10 minutes ago, I had 10 numbers to count and I count at the rate of 10 numbers per minute. Why don't you think that there's something deeper that worry doesn't address? That's how you've been putting it to me before, I thought.
Well, it's the whole series. Why is that whole series located at this series of temporal intervals, this beginningless series of temporal intervals, rather than at some other beginningless series of temporal intervals? That's a kind of tenseless way of putting it, but I think that has to be what he's asking.
So suppose that you tell a story where God decrees that at that temporal interval you will say this number, and at that temporal interval you'll say this number, and so on. And so then you've got an explanation. But what you're saying is Craig is going to read that as that's not a good enough explanation, right? Because why would God decree that you're going to say those numbers at those times rather than at other times. Is that the idea?
That's not my idea.
I mean, is that your idea of Craig?
I'm fine with God, if God exists, saying it's going to happen at these times, not at those times. That seems like a partial explanation to me. But then you'd say, well, why did God make that choice? I can't imagine Craig going down that road. That's Leibniz, right? Once you start asking, but what is God's reason, right? And every time you give a reason, you say, yeah, but why was that reason effective, right? Why did he go with that reason rather than with some other reason? And then there's going to have to be some further reason. And there's no place to stop that regress short of, something that's logically necessary and logically entails the whole thing. And then you get the modal collapse that Alex was referring to. Craig believes in libertarian agent causation. It's perfectly one of the reasons why he wants to go for a more modest principle of sufficient reason is that he wants to leave room for libertarian freedom, I think. So I don't see him going there. Well, we could make up some reason for God. I mean, philosophers can always make up the whole thing is imaginary. It's just an imaginary case. Why is he saying there couldn't be any explanation at all? Why, if there's one infinite counter, there could be two. There could be one that's finishing his count now, and another who's finishing her count a moment ago, right? And it could be that the first counter always makes sure that he's counting what the other one is counting -1 if it's the negative numbers we're doing, or +1 if it's counting down from, right, through all the positive numbers. And Craig will say, well, that's kicking the can down the road. Well, let's kick it down the road again. His claim was that there can't be any explanation at all. I give him an explanation. He says, well, what's the explanation of that? Well, if that's the argument, then say so, right? And don't give us this argument about successive addition and counters and so on. Just give us an argument about how there can't be infinite causal chains, or there can't be infinite series of explanations, and tell us why that is and why you need God in order to jumpstart the whole thing. I mean, that just seems like a different argument to me.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think then he's effectively saying, well, it's a promissory note that it's paid in him handing you Alexander Proust's book on the principle of sufficient reasoning and just saying, read that. That's where the answer is. That's what it feels like at the moment. He doesn't really have much to say in the way of that.
Well, none of this has any longer anything to do with the original successive addition argument. Nothing. As far as I can see.
Yeah. So when Landon and I talked about this before, I was bringing up this idea that, I mean, there's something weird about saying, that well, I suppose it was in the previous argument, right? Like if you say, look, if say this person has been counting forever in the past, then if that was enough to establish that they're finishing now, and then the argument would be, well, and also for the moment before that, they'd been counting forever, and that would be enough to establish that they'd finished the moment before this one. And of course, from the moment before that, you could say that they'd been counting forever. So that would be enough to show that they must have finished at that moment as well. And in that way, you could be driven back into the past and find that there's never a point at which you're doing anything other than finishing counting. So that basically kind of shows that you couldn't be counting at any moment in the past. And it's something kind of sort of absurd about that argument that's brought out by considering the mirror image of that, like where you say, well, imagine someone's about to start counting upwards now. Say Cameron is just about to start counting upwards. But of course, we could make the observation that he's still got infinitely many numbers to count. And if that's enough to say, well, he should be starting his count now, then we could say, well, in a second time, when he's counted up as far as 2, we could pause and say, well, he's still got infinitely many numbers to count. So that must mean that he should be starting his count now, right? And the same for 3. So infinitely many numbers, that's enough to establish that he should be starting his count now. And that shows you that you can never start counting up to infinity either, right? It's like, but no one would think that, right? Because it doesn't matter how many numbers you've got left to count, right? That's irrelevant to how many numbers you've counted or whether you can start counting at that point. It's just got nothing to do with it, right? All that matters, if anything matters, it's how many numbers have you counted yet? And sometimes the answer will be none because I haven't started. Sometimes the answer will be like 1 or 17 or something like that. And that's all you should focus on, is that finite portion of what's going on. And it's the same with the counting down. It just doesn't matter how many numbers you've counted already. That's like informationally irrelevant to what you can deduce from that. It just matters how many have you got left to count down. If the answer is none, if you say, I've been counting down forever and I've got none left, that's enough to show that you must be finishing now. Not that guy should be finishing, right? But that condition doesn't hold at all of the previous times, right? Because a moment ago you would have had one number still left to count, right? So that's a larger condition that really does entail him finishing now, doesn't hold at the previous times. Anyway, so like once you mirror the argument, it sort of brings out the weakness of it. Like you can sort of be fooled into thinking, hey, he should have already finished, I guess. But when you think like he's got infinite numbers left to count, that he should have only just started, that like obviously doesn't work. And it sort of seems like there's something like that with the sufficient reason thing. I mean, like, say I start counting now, right? And you could say, well, but why did you start counting now rather than in a moment's time? I mean, I can explain that, right? Like, that's when I wanted to start counting. I mean, like, don't expect to. Do I have to give you an explanation for why each and every future time isn't the time I chose to start counting at? No, it would be weird to think that I have to give an explanation for that. But for some reason, when it comes to the counting down thing, in just as infinite context of infinite past, I'm expected to explain why that happened. Like, I don't know. It's just something. Maybe there's some explanatory asymmetry here, which I'm not grasping.
In the counting up case. It does seem a bit different. I mean, if you're raising the question why, I mean that could in principle be answered.
Yeah, well, I guess it could.
I've been wanting to count for a really long time, but I've been busy with other things, and right today at this moment, it seemed like the good time. Well, you can't give that kind of answer in the case of a beginningless count.
Yeah, but can't I? Because, I mean, isn't that can kicking to some extent? Because I'm going to say, well, but why did you have that desire? Like, why have you been putting it off? And then you have to say, well, because, I have this other antecedent desire, and blah, blah, blah.
Yeah.
And we're never going to get an ultimate explanation for why I started now rather than in 2 minutes' time. But does that mean there's no explanation, not even a partial one? I just feel like all I'm doing is adapting Craig's argument and patching it onto a future tense version, but it looks really, really weak when you're doing it like that. But I just feel like there's no distance between the two arguments. Still.
I think the only point at which you and I have a disagreement, perhaps, is that I think Craig's question has to be about the series as a whole. So define the series of countings any way you like. Let the rates change over time, let them be the same, let them be different, make up any story you want about that. Craig is going to say it was always already the case that there had been enough time for a series exactly like that one that you've just described to have been completed at that time. And then, to that why then this time rather than that other time, to that question, he says there can be no answer. I believe that has to be what he's on about. Now, I don't think it's at all clear that there can be no answer at all. I mean, But then that goes back to this question about, well, what do you mean when you say partial explanation?
Yeah.
What's required for that? I can make up a story, you know, that seems like a partial answer to that question. I just don't see why I can't do that. I mean, nothing was included in the original thought experiment about why the counter is doing what he's doing, or why he's finishing now rather than at some other time when presumably he had already had enough time to finish. Nothing's been included, but that doesn't mean that we couldn't make something up. But to do that, we'd have to go outside the count itself, I think. We'd have to tell a story about something other than the count itself. Right? God, maybe, or, you know, a series of demons that are making sure that, you know, the counter is counting the right thing at each moment, or, you know, we could imagine other infinite counters with the guy doing this count keying what he's counting at the moment to what those others have counted a moment previously. I mean, those are all stories. We could just stick them in. I don't know where this goes. I mean, the objection will be that we're kicking the can down the road, that there, you know, is going to have to be an explanation of that explanation, and then an explanation of that further explanation. If that's the argument, then what we're really talking about is whether or not there can be an infinite chain of explanations, and whether that's satisfactory. And there are, you know, there is a debate about that. And some finitists think that there can't be an infinite series of explanations, and that's where, you know, Grim Reapers can come into the discussion and so on. By the way, if I could just stick this in here, it's kind of a side point. But I don't know why Craig is introducing Grim Reaper problems in the context of the successive addition argument. It doesn't have anything to do with the successive addition argument. If the Grim Reaper problem were a real problem, it would be equally applicable on an eternalist view of time. I mean, you know, you have a beginningless series of Grim Reapers, each of which will kill you if and only if the previous Reaper has not killed you. You get the same contradiction. It doesn't have anything to do with the passage of time.
Yeah, that's right.
And as Craig explains it, the objectivity of temporal becoming is absolutely critical here. I think he said that the Kalam argument as a whole just presupposed an A theory of time. And that's clearly the case with the successive addition argument. The way he explains successive addition and formation by successive addition is entirely in terms of the passage of time.
That's right. And I think that when we were talking about what makes the actual infinite problematic, you know, so going back to the first argument, there was something inherently temporal, like atheoretic about that, because it ended up being, you have to think of the difference between the infinite past and the infinite future being something like time has passed and accumulated a bunch of things that have become actual or whatever as events or something, and that is what makes the difference between the past and the future, such that the past is an actually infinite collection, but the future is only a potentially infinite one. So unless you have that atheoretic notion, like if it was all done in the B theory, it's not just that the successive addition argument wouldn't work, but the Hilbert's Hotel argument basically wouldn't work either, because then it would be susceptible, and obviously so, to the symmetry counterpoint, right? So it's weird that Craig's now saying, oh, the Grim Reaper paradox is relevant, and Locke's, and he referenced your argument as well, Landon, which is, I mean, I took your argument to be a reformulation of Locke's, and Locke's argument is one where the badge on the outside of the box when you buy it says that the good thing about it is that it works with the B theory as well as the A theory, right? That's what Locke's really pleased with himself for having come up with an argument that's not dependent on the A theory. So if Craig's retreating to Landon's reformulation of Locke's argument and the Grim Reaper paradox, it just feels like the A theory is now not relevant to the Kalam anymore, right?
I actually don't think that that's the argument Craig was referring to.
Oh, right.
Yeah, so I think he's referring to, I have this argument at the very end of the paper Heartbreak at Hilbert's Hotel, because I go through a lot of these worries that we've talked about here, and the past could have an actually infinite number of events, but they don't exist on the presentist view, so there's no problem. And so at the very end, I suggest that I think what Craig is actually trying to argue is this. Premise one, there cannot be a world in which an actually infinite number of things have been actualized. Premise two, if the actual world is one in which the universe is past eternal, then there's a world in which an actually infinite number of things have been actualized. Therefore, the actual world cannot be one in which the universe is past eternal. So the critical finitist premise here has changed from an actually infinite number of things cannot exist to there cannot be a world in which an actually infinite number of things have been actualized. And what happened with that argument, I think that Locke, in replying to that, just used that formulation. And that doesn't have the future, the past future parallel objection to it. Well, according to the way that that they're understanding it. And I think Craig, in his paper in that book, I think he referenced that formulation, and he said, see, this formulation doesn't have the problem. And so I think that that's what he's talking about. But in my new formulation of it, he hasn't seen that. Or at least, I don't, as far as I know, he hadn't seen that. So the way I would formulate the argument now, if I could, is premise one, if the universe didn't begin to exist, then it's possible for an actually infinite number of things to exist. Two, it's not possible for an actually infinite number of things to exist. Conclusion, therefore, the universe began to exist. And so I think that that is still capturing the same idea, the main thrust of the idea that Locke and Craig are after. Does that ring true to you?
Yeah, so premise two is sorry, say premise two again.
It's not, well, that's just, it's not possible for an actually infinite number of things to exist.
Sorry, I meant premise one. Sorry, my bad.
Okay, if the universe didn't begin to exist, that is, if past eternalism is true, then it's possible for an actually infinite number of things to exist.
Does that mean to exist all at once?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's Locke's argument, isn't it?
I don't think, well, I don't know if Locke ever formulated it like that, but that's my formulation of the argument that Locke is making. Right.
That's how Locke put it in an email exchange with me, which we quoted at the end of our paper.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
So I thought you got that formulation from my paper.
Well, maybe Locke got it from your paper.
No, because you had that email exchange with Locke before my paper was published.
Ah, right. Well,
in any case, wherever it came from, that's the formulation that I have in this paper, and I think it obviously, if Locke agrees with it, it captures what the spirit of his argument is.
It definitely, that is definitely his argument. He has the the present generator. So the present generator is that's a different version of the argument, but he has a hotel room generator and a guest generator or whatever. I take it that argument, although somewhat clumsily expressed in his book, is trying to say the argument that you just said there. And I had a very lengthy email exchange with him a while back, and in that he stated it almost word for word the way that you did, and that's what we took ourselves to be responding to at the end of our paper. Yeah, okay. So I think that argument is susceptible to temporal mirroring, and that's what I was talking about before, which is if it's possible to destroy without creating hotel rooms every day, and the time is endless, then there's a Hilbert's Hotel in the present. There isn't a Hilbert's Hotel in the present, therefore time is not endless. I think that's it seems to me, maybe I could word it so that it's more perfectly mirroring exactly what you said, but it feels to me like Craig, and I think your claim that doesn't suffer from a temporal rewording so that it points at the future instead of the past. So I feel like I want to test that to make sure.
So the mirror would be, if the universe doesn't have an end, that is, if future eternalism is true, then it's possible for an actually infinite number of things to exist.
Yeah, right, exactly. And the reasoning would be, and you'd say, well, why is that, right? And the reasoning would be, well, because if God existed and he could destroy a hotel room without creating one every day of that infinite future, which seems like it's within his omnipotence to do, or you could just say, if it's possible that a hotel room gets destroyed, don't have to bring God into it, collapses, and on a day where none gets rebuilt, that type of event seems like it's possible. And if the future is infinite, then that could happen every day. But if that could happen every day, then there'd be a Hilbert's Hotel today. It's the same argument.
But if you're a finitist, you're going to say that can happen at any time, but it can't happen at every time because you're going to run out of hotel rooms, right? You're going to say there's only a finite number of hotel rooms to be destroyed, and the backwards parallel, I don't think you would say, well, God couldn't create an infinite number of them because there's only a finite number to be created, right? Like there's an infinite number of possible ones.
I think the finitist intuition in there would be to say something like, there's only a finite amount of material out of which you can make hotel rooms, right? And then there might be some finite limit on how many, and then that would put a limit on how many days in the past he could have been making hotel rooms for, and that would work just as well, right? So if that finitist answer works for the future, I think that's how it works for the past too. But if you want to say that there's some way around that in the past, it requires creation ex nihilo, right? You have to say, well, there's some hotel room that just pops into some non-pre-existing matter just pops into existence in the shape of a hotel room without one being destroyed at the same time. And if that's possible to happen every day, and that is actually a fanciful hypothesis in the first place that you could doubt on its own, right? That actually is possible for any day. But let's suppose that we do think that that's true. Then it feels like the exact opposite of that would be to say that one pre-existing matter shaped like a hotel room just disappears without another one popping up to replace it on a day. That's just the exact opposite. Like, why think that one of those is possible without, if anything, the idea of the hotel room just popping out of existence without one popping in to replace it feels more metaphysically plausible to me than one popping into existence from nothing without something being destroyed at the same time. Like, why think that? If anything, the future tense version, I certainly don't think it's less plausible. The metaphysical, assumptions it makes are, I think it ends in a draw. So you can't say that one of them is better than the other.
Right. So the finitist has to say, they have to rely on creation ex nihilo to get this off the ground.
Yeah.
So I agree with you there. And then there's the question of whether they're entitled to assume that, right? Which is the point that I press in my paper. But I guess I don't see. I mean, obviously, it's a lot more plausible to say it's possible to destroy a hotel room than it is to say it's possible to create a hotel room out of nothing.
Mm-hmm.
That's obviously. I mean, if we're choosing plausibilities here, it's clear which one of those is more plausible. But it seems to me that the finitist in the future case is going to say you will run out of hotel rooms, and in the previous, or in the backwards looking case, the past case, they're just imagining new ones being, popping into existence out of nothing. I guess I don't understand what the parallel
Well, okay, it seems to
How,
me that the finitist there is going to say you will run out of hotel rooms, right? Because finitism is true, right? And what that means is basically that there isn't a Hilbert's Hotel right now, right? And okay, fine. If that's the way the reasoning goes, then the finitist should be able to say God can't make a hotel room at every point in the past. Why? Because finitism is true, and that just means that there isn't a Hilbert's Hotel in the present, right? So nothing that entails a Hilbert's Hotel actually is possible. Like if you can say, I mean, that's the same reasoning, right? If you're allowed to say it in terms of the future, then you're allowed to say it in terms of the past there. But in the case of the past, Locke is going to say, hold on, you're begging the question, right? It just, I'm just showing that it's an implication of the actual infinite past that a Hilbert's Hotel would be possible, like as a reductio. And all you're doing is just begging the question against that by saying that the reductio is impossible. But it isn't, right? The premises of the reductio are plausible. So you have to like follow it where it goes. Whereas I'm just saying, no, fuck that. The first premise of your reductio, I just deny that, so it doesn't get off the ground. And he thinks that's question begging. But in the second case, when we look at the future, he's going to say, no, hold on. The first premise of that is false because there's no Hilbert's Hotel in the present. And that's the same thing. It's exactly the same move. So I don't see. To me, I'm convinced of the symmetry of this setup. So I don't see that you can make one of those moves without the other. I'm fully convinced by this reviewer's objection that they put to us in the paper. I didn't know what to think of it to begin with, and we were a bit puzzled, and we ended up saying back to them, we don't know what to say about this, can we just leave it out? And they were okay with it. But now I feel like I almost want to write a paper on this topic alone, just to say I think this is a decisive symmetry move. I don't know, Wes, what do you think?
Let me see if I understand this. With the future-oriented version of this, what we're saying is that for each future day, say, it's possible. No, let me start over. It's possible that for each future day, God destroys a hotel room that already exists right now. Permanently destroys a hotel room that exists right now.
And doesn't build a new one to replace it.
And that's possible only if there exist infinitely many hotel rooms right now.
As long as you tag on the bit that he doesn't build a new one in its place.
Well, I said destroys one that exists right now.
Okay, I suppose that's true. Yeah, okay, fine.
It's possible that at each of infinitely many future days, God destroys a hotel room, one of the ones that exists right now, right?
Yeah.
And that's possible only if there are infinitely many hotel rooms right now.
Yeah, that feels like it then, that feels more egregious or something, because you're saying that exists right now bit. So if, let's say the original Locke argument like that then, so you would be saying it's possible for each time in the past, it's possible that God made a hotel room that exists right now, right? And then the person who thinks that Hilbert's Hotel can't exist is going to see where this is going pretty quickly and say, hold on, it couldn't be obviously that for each of those times, right? Because you're telling me in premise, when the antecedent of premise one, that each of those hotel rooms exists right now, and I can tell where that's going. So I'm going to object to this on the basis that Hilbert's Hotel is impossible to exist right now in exactly the same way. Because it's just when you say pre-existing hotel, you kind of know where it's going. So it feels wrong at the beginning. I don't know, I'm giving a psychological explanation that might not be very convincing.
Well, personally, I feel much more inclined to say that each past day is such that God could have created a hotel room ex nihilo on that day than I do say, each future day is such that God could have destroyed a hotel room, one of the ones that exists right now. I mean, it seems to me that any finitist worth his salt is going to say, whoa, wait a minute, right? There's more reason to think that each past day is such that God could have done that than there is to say that each future day is such that God could destroy a hotel room, one of the ones that already exists. It's very hard to say this clearly. But if you don't stick in one of the ones that already exists, right, you don't get the conclusion that you're looking for, that it has to be already the case that infinitely many hotel rooms exist right now. I mean, the rooms that are destroyed have to be ones that are already in existence.
Well, I wonder, because I was stating the argument before so in the original version, the past tense version, you say it's not stated in terms of hotel rooms that are existing now. It's possible for each day in the past, it's possible that on that day, God brings a hotel room into existence without destroying any, or without any others being destroyed in any way. So there's one more hotel room than there was previously. So you don't have to talk about how many exist now. Like a magician, you pull that rabbit out of the hat late in the second premise, right? But you just state the first premise as if it's just a thing that could happen on a day, right? There's nothing to do with now. And then if we do it the same way for the future, you just say, it's possible that God, like on a given day, on any given Sunday, is just, spending it destroying a hotel room and not building a new one in its place. And it just feels like an isolated sort of bubble of possibility that doesn't have any relationship to the present, right? So if you set it up in the same way, if you set it up that way, it has the same logical effect as the way you did it, but without actually mentioning that exists in the present in the first premise, right? And then it has a sort of psychological effect on the person who's reading the argument to think, I'm just considering a kind of intrinsic possibility that's a bubble unto itself, and surely that's true for any time in the past or any time in the future. And then you just sort of find, what's happened? I've just added them all up, all this infinite number, and I find that means there's a Hilbert's Hotel in the present. Like, whoops! And so it feels like my thought is that we somehow have a psychological like habit or something, as a sort of familiarity with things accumulating over time from the past, we very rarely think about the mirror image of that, like destroying things in the future, that we just approach these two premises, which are effectively logically equivalent to each other, but tensed in a different way, as if they have some significant difference that they actually don't. I think it's just a psychological disposition that has something to do with familiarity or something. I might be wrong about that, but that's how it strikes me.
I think I'm not yet persuaded. I feels as if there's some sort of each-all fallacy below the surface here.
Modal scope fallacy. You've found them in many of my blogs and things in the
past. Each future day is such that God could be destroying a hotel room on that day. So could it be the case of all future days, that all of them are days on which God is destroying a hotel room? I mean, I feel the pressure to assert the first thing, assuming there's a God who can create things and destroy things. Sure. Each day, each future day could be one on which he destroys a hotel room. Fine.
But not all.
But how?
But what? But so what?
Each day is a day on which he could be doing that. But I don't see how it. But it obviously doesn't follow that it could be that he will do that on every day.
Or that he can do that on every day. Right?
Every day will be such that he can do it. But it doesn't follow that it can be that he will do it on each and every day.
Right. And don't you say in your paper, at the end of your paper with Alex, I mean, I think that's your response to Locke as well, right? It could be the case for each day in the past.
Exactly.
That God, yeah,
exactly.
but not all, right?
Exactly. But I think that's what Alex is going for here, probably. I mean, he wants to say that there's a parallel between those two, and that the move that you have to take to block this other future-oriented thing is equally good when we're talking about a beginningless past. I think that's where Alex is going.
That's my thought, definitely.
Yeah, I'm not sure about that one. I wasn't sure about it when that referee brought it up either. I I kept on thinking, well, the finest is just going to say, no, of course not. I mean, there's no infinite hotel. There can't be one. So therefore, it can't be the case that on each and every day, God will be destroying one of them.
Yeah, okay. So it's like the way out of the first argument, which it was also brought up in the discussion. Someone asked how I would respond to Proust's argument, which is Locke's argument, but with a Grim Reaper additional premise in there, right? Instead of Hilbert's Hotel, it's a Grim Reaper sequence would be possible in this scenario. But his explanation of the first premise is just to say, he basically just says this, that if the past was infinite, then you could have added a hotel room, one per day, and you'd have a Hilbert's Hotel today. That's basically his argument. So the way that it seems to me is that the right thing to say there, like we do in the paper, is to say, look, if infinitely many hotel rooms could spring into existence ex nihilo on any given day, then a Hilbert's Hotel is, but you don't need an infinite past or whatever. It's just Hilbert's Hotel just is possible, right, at any point in time. So in order to stop that being the shortcut that stops the whole conversation, you have to say, well, okay, on any given day, only finitely many hotel rooms can pop into existence, right? That otherwise the argument doesn't get off the ground. But once you've made that, there's some kind of finitist concession to what the extent of creation ex nihilo is, right? Then the right thing to say is what applies, that finitist rule then doesn't just apply to any one day, actually applies to the whole sequence of days, because you're looking at saying, so you're saying something like, if only finitely many hotel rooms can spring into existence on a given day, then if you had an infinitely long street, right, on any given day, you could have n many hotel rooms, hotels filling up the addresses on that infinitely long street, right, for any n. But you couldn't have every single address on that infinitely long street being immediately populated all in one go on any given day, right? So what's the limit there? The limit is kind of infinity, but you can't actually. It's like the limit's on the other side of the things that you can possibly do on any given day. Like that's how this restriction applies. And then all you do is just say, if that's how it works for infinite avenue, that's also how it works for the infinite past as well. Like it's just not true. So God could spend any n amount of days in the past making hotel rooms, but he couldn't spend all of them. Right? That's the effect of having this restriction on creation ex nihilo. And if that's right, then that solves the problem for you already. You just don't need to. It just isn't possible that he fills every day in the past doing that. But the problem with that is that someone like Locke's going to say that won't do, right? That's totally unsatisfactory, right? Because the difference is, well, God just could be making hotel rooms. Consider each day on its own, right? Forget about the whole sequence of things. On any given day, he could just make a new hotel room without destroying one, right? So what you have to do is zoom in on the given day on its own, and because I was insisting you have to think about the whole sequence of days in the past and just say we couldn't do all of them, right? You could do any n, but not all of them. And he's saying, well, that won't do because for each individual day, that day could have been a room creation day. And that holds for all of the rooms. So you can't block the possibility that he fills the whole of the past by making hotel rooms. Like I was just trying to say, you've got to put the limit as any n, but not every n, right? And he's saying, well, that's just unsatisfactory to put that there because he could do it on any individual one. But then this is where the reviewer's comment comes in, because it's like, but he's going to want to do exactly what I'm insisting on and he's finding unacceptable when it comes to the future, because he's going to say, of course, God could destroy n many hotel rooms or spend n many days destroying finite hotel rooms for any n, but he couldn't spend the whole of the future doing that. Otherwise, it would have the implication that Hilbert's Hotel is present. But that's exactly the restriction on how many times can be filled up with this hotel room destruction creation events. I mean, but it's completely arbitrary to say that it's fine to stick that restriction on the future, but not on the past. I mean, like, why? What's the difference between them? It's just the same distinction, it seems to me. So it feels to me like once you go through the dialectic step by step from the beginning, that the parallelism is totally relevant, right? because all you've got left is the objection, or Locke's objection, the specific objection he brought up with me in the email exchange, was that like it won't do to just say that God couldn't fill all of those past times with making hotel rooms, because effectively he was saying zoom in on each one of them. For each, it's true that he could have done it on that day, right? So he was saying, but of course I can do the same thing on the future. Pick a day in the future. He could, of course, be destroying a hotel room on that any given Sunday, right? But so yeah, I don't know. It does seem to me that those two arguments are relevantly similar to each other.
In the future case, he has a plausible explanation of why you can't go from each is possible to it's possible at all. And that explanation is that there are only finitely many rooms. There can be only finitely many rooms now.
But why isn't that the same
Right.
if I say he couldn't have spent an infinite past doing it because there's only finitely many rooms now, right? It seems like it's the same thing.
Can't actually, let me rephrase that a little bit. Wouldn't it be the explanation for why God can't do that in the future is that there are only a finite number of things right now? Right? I mean, he was gonna look at the it's not that there can only be a finite number of things. I think it's the fact that there are only a finite number of things right now. And then in the past example, you can't say, well, why couldn't God have done that? Because there are only a finite number of things right now, because we're talking, I think we're talking counterfactually. If God had done that, then there would be, and that it would lead to an impossibility.
So then I think the worry, he also expressed that type of worry, which we also brought up in the paper and I think dealt with, which is that, so what you're saying is that the current state of affairs ties his hand on some past room creation event thing, right? And that's implausible because it's like backwards in time effect, right? Whereas in the future case, it's easy to see how the current state of affairs, i.e. the finite number of hotel rooms that currently exist, ties his hand about how many rooms he can destroy in the future, right? That's why causal effect travels forward. So the reason he's going to run out of hotel rooms at some point in the future is causally because of the fact there's only finitely many today. And let's say he never makes any more hotel rooms. So that sort of it feels like there's a causal asymmetry there. But the reply is, of course, like if God can only make finitely many hotel rooms on each day, right, which is the first point of the dialectic. Otherwise, Hilbert's hotel is just plainly possible, regardless of the infinity of the past, right? If he can only make finitely many hotel rooms on a given day, and there's an infinite hotel today, then it follows that for any day in the past, there already was an infinite hotel, right? So the problem with God, Locke was encouraging me to look at some day in the past as a bubble on its own and encouraging me to think, but all that's happening there is him making the hotel room, and there's nothing wrong with that. God could easily do that. But actually the scenario has to be for there to be enough infinite hotel today and God's room creation power is restricted to only making finitely many hotel rooms at any given point, that he's actually adding some finite number of hotel rooms to an existing Hilbert's hotel, right? And if Hilbert's hotel is impossible, that isn't a possibility, right? You're describing an impossible world there, right? One where it's true that Hilbert's hotel is not possible and there is a Hilbert's hotel. So that's not within the domain of possible worlds. That's in the domain of inconsistent, impossible worlds. So you want my quantifiers to range over possible worlds to talk about what's possible. It doesn't include that world, right? So actually, to make the argument run, you've got to do something like have a dialethic logic that's in quantifying over impossible worlds, or like a paraconsistent logic or something. And I mean, he was like, no, I'm definitely not saying that. That's not what I mean. So you could take that move, but that's clearly not what he's trying to say. And it just seems to me that he's a classical guy. He's not doing dialethic logic, but he's just confused about what worlds are in the domain of possible worlds there. He wants to have his cake and eat it or something.
I suppose to pursue the parallel, you'd say that in the future case, on each future day, there will still be infinitely many rooms.
That's right, exactly. Yeah. Yeah, because God, no matter how many rooms he destroys, he could destroy 1 billion rooms a day. He's tearing them off this hotel because it's an infinite hotel.
Infinitely many.
Yeah, that's right, exactly. He may as well stop. It wouldn't make any difference to how many hotel rooms there are. In fact, all the guests that were still there, no matter how effective God is at destroying them, can just shuffle up and they've still got a room each at the end of it. It doesn't make any difference. It's just as luxurious as it was before he started destroying the hotel room.
Well, now you have to be careful. You just said all of the guests, but it is true that for each of the guests they can shuffle, but not that all of them can shuffle.
That's true. I am guilty of making multiple modal operator shift fallacies pretty much every time I talk about this. So that's true.
Especially in your blogs.
Especially in my blogs.
In your email exchange with Erasmus.
Yeah.
Oh.
What's that about? Oh dear. Anyway, I like Erasmus. He's a nice guy, but Craig said it was an unsolicited email that Erasmus sent him out of the blue, an exchange that he and I have had. So that wasn't fair, I thought, quoting something that I haven't published and haven't agreed to be on the table, but never mind.
That's okay.
It's probably a footnote here. I don't know whether any of this is going, which parts of this you're going to think are worth spreading beyond the three of us. But just in case any part of this discussion is published and Craig gets a hold of it, it has to be said that in our paper, we were just assuming for the sake of argument that a Hilbert's Hotel is impossible.
Yeah.
But you don't actually agree with that, right? But either of you?
Yeah, I think it's just a very weird hotel.
Yeah, I think that it might be possible. It's epistemically possible that it's metaphysically possible, and it's epistemically possible that it's metaphically impossible. I just don't really know.
No idea. Well,
so you don't have your mind made up.
It seems to me that space could have been infinite. In fact, it seems to me that space could have been Euclidean. If we're just talking metaphysical possibility and so on, what God could have created, it seems to me it could have been that space is infinite. And had it been, then it seems to me that there could have been a Hilbert's Hotel. And why do I think that? I don't know, just simple Euclidean intuitions, go off in a straight line. You don't ever bump up against the end. There's always more. So yeah, I'm inclined to think there could have been a Hilbert's Hotel. Whether any of the various universes that may exist are such that there could be a Hilbert's Hotel in them, I don't know. But it does have these weird properties.
Yeah, so I mean, one of the things I was interested in is this idea that an actually infinite number of things can't exist, that in certain ways we're kind of granting for the sake of argument in the papers, and then still testing the argument in other ways, right? And I was just, when I think about all of the times I've talked to philosophers about this question, it feels like hardly any philosopher is convinced by, the absurdity of Hilbert's Hotel, that therefore it's impossible. I mean, it seems like when I have talked to philosophers, they have said, yeah, infinity is strange, but that's different than saying that it's impossible. And I was interested looking into, like, getting ready for this. I was looking at the new book by Proust, and he says, but while Hilbert's Hotel is indubitably strange, the strange and the absurd or impossible are different, as proved by the strangeness of the platypus. And then he goes on to say, he thinks there's a very strong reason to reject finitism and accept the possibility of something like Hilbert's Hotel. And so there's a book on infinity where the author thinks it's possible. And then I think Michael Humer's got a book on infinity where he thinks a Hilbert's Hotel is possible. Graham Oppie has a book on infinity where he thinks a Hilbert's Hotel is possible. But it seems like Craig and Locke, for example, have kind of a certainty that this is impossible and all these experts are just completely wrong. And I mean, in Locke's version of it, it goes to a bit of an extreme because he thinks, because it's in a deductive argument, like you can get certainty that the conclusion is true through the argument. But I mean, that would be the case if you're certain that it's sound. But I mean, the fact that so many experts on metaphysics and infinity seem to just disagree with that premise should cast some doubt on whether that's actually true, right?
Craig thinks we've all been brainwashed by taking too much math. I'm not guilty of that, but
I don't think I am either.
Alex might be.
No, I'm definitely not. So we might be brainwashed.
I wonder what a physicist would think if we said, well, you really should think that space is finite because if it weren't, there could be a Hilbert's Hotel, and it has these absurd features.
Yeah, or they sometimes will say, I think that there might be an infinite number of universes in the multiverse, and you could just say, well, hold on a second.
That can't
Let
be.
me tell you about Hilbert's Hotel, right? Or let me tell you about Craig's library, and then that
could
you
be
can
one
just
room
rule out
in each universe.
Right.
It could be.
Well, yeah, and the most striking example of this, of course, is Benedetti, right? Who Craig, as I said in the debate, wheels out on these occasions as if he's, to Benedetti is the guy who came up with the Grim Reaper paradox before it was called the Grim Reaper paradox, right? And the deafening gong paradox and the book with infinite pages in, right? And his book is fantastic, and I recommend it, right? The Infinity, an Essay in Metaphysics by Jose Benedetti. Right. So he says all these weird things about, like, if the book has infinitely many pages on, and it's page 1 up here, right? Turn the book over, lift the cover off, and what do you see on the back side, right? If it's a Zeno sequence that's like each of the pages is progressively thinner than the previous one, or whatever, you're expecting to see a sort of infinitesimally thin. Well, there isn't a final page, I suppose, right? It's just a never-ending sequence of pages. So he's like, well, what would you see when you turn the page over? And Craig says, well, that's Benedetti's example, and it's one of these ones that's a sort of clincher for like pumping your intuitions or whatever. And Benedetti does say, he's kind of crazy. I mean, he would have been a really fun guy to know, I think. But like he talks about, like, I think it's in this example, he talks about, like, well, you've got to think, would it be possible? What would it be like if I had infinitely many eyes, like an octopus with infinitely many tentacles, and each one of them is looking at each of the pages? Well, maybe that's what it would look like, right? So, I mean, his answer is weird, but like, it's not like he says, oh yeah, that can't exist. He's just trying to, like, he's getting into the weirdness and thinking about what stuff would be like if those sorts of things happen. So I don't think he's a good person for Craig to wheel in here as an example of someone who's on his side. I mean, it would do. Just read the blurb of the book, right? He says this is a passionate defense of the possibility of the actual infinite. Like, it's exactly the opposite of what Craig thinks he's arguing for. So, yeah, I don't know. I think I'm going to have to call it a day because it's actually 11:15, and even though I'm working from home, I still have to actually work tomorrow. So it's been very, very enjoyable talking to you both this evening. So thank you very much for coming on.
Same here.
Yeah, I agree.